Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Rise of the Tau in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Part 231. Enemy at the gate. They are hurting him. They are actually hurting him. He spoke to himself more than to any other, for Kodian found the distant sight almost too unbelievable to comprehend. The combined efforts of the factions currently assaulting the Void Dragon were actually having some effect. He lost sight of the hulking abomination then as the Necrontyr renewed their attack on the gateway. Shouts of alarm and warning were followed a second after by the sound of untold metal bodies crashing together, a sound he had already grown accustomed to. "Take heart," he cried, readying his pistols once again. He shouldered his way through the press to better meet the enemy, ignoring the cries of pain and surprise his advance instigated. "Once more they come, and once more we shall turn them aside. Let these BDS dash themselves against us, for we will stand firm. They shall not break us. They shall not turn us aside. We fight beneath the gaze of our Emperor, and he will judge us on our efforts this day." The Void Shields screamed their buzzing, guttural scream as the Necrons surged forward once again. Gauze fire hammered against the layered force fields incessantly, the sheer weight of fire forcing the protective energies to overload again and again. The shield generators of the Emperor's palace were of a particularly ancient and powerful design, able to cycle through their layers and recharge faster than any in the galaxy, but still they were hard pressed to keep the murderous barrage at bay. The outer defense lines had not lasted long. The metal abominations had suffered greatly at the hands of the brave defenders, that much could not be denied. The hundreds of war machines and emplacements surrounding the gate had exacted a heavy toll upon the advancing Necrons. Each and every gun had reaped more of their fair share of the enemy before finally falling to the endless legions, but fall they had. The outcome was always inevitable, but fortunately, at least for the defenders, it had been intended to be that way. Untold numbers had already given their lives just to thin the numbers of their foe. But now the Necrontyr were literally at the threshold, and for all their magnificence and strength, the Void Shields could not last indefinitely. This much was already beginning to show. Even as Kodian fought to steal the resolve of those around him, the first of the Necrons began to penetrate the Void Shields. The layered walls of energy flickered wildly as the first of them threw themselves through the interchanging barriers, only to land at the feet of the defenders amid a series of dull clunks and flailing arms, their bisected forms glowing where the fields had cut them in two. Kodian reached the head of the defenses as the next machine managed to make it through, minus a trailing arm. He used his momentum to carry him into the proximity of the thing and put a round of blazing plasma through its face, sending its remains arching back. He swung his other arm out in time to hammer a brace of bolt rounds into the next successful Necron, this time shattering the machine's torso and blowing it apart. The same thing happened at that instant all across the threshold of the gate. A handful of the enemy pushed their way through, most losing a limb or sustaining damage as they did so. The interlopers were quickly and violently put down by the defenders, but by that time the rot was beginning to set in. The enemy fire visibly increased as this weakness became apparent, undoubtedly intended to capitalize on the fact that the Void Shield generators were starting to deteriorate. Entire areas were suddenly swamped with gauze fire as the Necrons fought to find a weak spot. Whether or not the enemy were aware of the nature of the Void Shields was unknown, but they seemed to understand how they worked. Kodian threw himself to the right as a salvo of beams speared in. They lasted only a second before the fresh layers of force cut them short, but that second was enough to see them carve through the packed mass of bodies and kill or seriously injure a score of people. This was it, he knew that within minutes the Void Dragon's forces would be through. The sheer weight of infantry firepower assailing the gate was bad enough, but the Necron war machines were punishing the Void Shields across their entire length, the huge weapons of the ancient machines sapping most of the protective energy. "Make ready to meet the enemy," he called, sweeping around to regard those behind him. "Death is not the end. Death is but the test, and to die in the service of the Emperor is to make the soul immortal. May all your souls be saved this day." There was no more he could say. Those gathered there knew only too well that survival was no longer a possibility, and that a noble, meaningful death was all any of them could truly wish for. There were those amongst the defenders that held no allegiance to the emperor or indeed to the human race. The Xenos were much fewer in number, but they were no less ready to give their lives to see the Necrontyr and the Void Dragon suffer. Eldar Rangers stalked silently through the crowds, ever seeking the best vantage point. Other, more stranger creatures stood side by side with their human counterparts, awaiting their inevitable doom. None of them had to wait long. Moments later the Void Shield's generators failed spectacularly. They collapsed beneath the sheer volume of force being deployed against them. The sound that death generated was a low, rumbling boom, an omnipotent groan of mechanical pain. The walls and floor shook as the ancient generators exploded deep beneath the feet of the defenders in a flash of light, followed by the clap of displaced air signaled the success of the enemy. Necrons flooded in through the breach, spilling forth like a storm surge as the barrier fell before them. Gauze fire flashed outwards from the silver tide to tear through the gathered bodies, killing scores of men and aliens. Codian raised both his pistols and fired indiscriminately into the coming horde, but he knew in that instant that he could make little difference here. The Primarchs were already waiting for the Void Dragon beneath the shadow of the Eternity Gate, and this was where he needed to be if the greater plan was to be realized. He felt a cold bitterness at leaving the Golgotha Barbican and its defenders behind, for it felt like a betrayal to him. He had asked these people to give their lives to stall the Necron hordes, and yet he would not be sharing their fate. Already the enemy fire was so thick in the air that it was dangerous just to be here, and he knew he would last no more than a few more seconds if he remained where he was. He had no choice. He turned into the crowds and willed the darkness to hurl him through the warp. The shadows did not keep him waiting long. The first thing he felt as the darkness spat him out into the chamber was the heat. It hit him like a wall, prickling against his skin and burning briefly in his throat before his enhanced body responded to the change in temperature. Here in the depths of the Eternity Crypt the temperature was usually low enough to layer the walls with a covering of frost, but not so now. Everywhere he looked, Codian could see little save for bodies. The mighty arched corridor was literally filled to bursting point with soldiers and Astaroths and other assorted warriors. Mechanikus. Priests were busy directing their Skitarii and hulking Praetorian machines into defensive positions. Astaroth's devastator squads could be seen up amongst the ancient stone archet raves or lining the many balconies that overlooked the approach to the Eternity March. He caught a glimpse of the wide, towering staircase beyond, and although he had visited this region once before, it still did not fail to draw a gasp of amazement from his lips. Thousands upon thousands of ancient banners thronged the march, many of them as old as the palace itself. All were lit from above by the soft, almost sentient lumen haze that drifted through the chamber like a ghostly mist. Untold numbers of gilded servo skulls and cherubim wheeled through the upper reaches of the chamber in great flocks, spreading clouds of incense or singing prayers of exaltation. Up in the furthest, shadow-wreathed corners of the vast space, hidden from mortal sight by both darkness and distance, colossal shapes stirred. Crimson pinpricks of light shifted in the void as the immense sentinel leviathans awoke. These vast and ancient machines had resided here since the construction of the palace. Neither their existence nor history was recorded in any known source, and there were none alive today save perhaps for the Primarchs who even knew of their existence. That they had guarded the Eternity Gate for thousands of years was a fact that had never been known to the billions of pilgrims who had trodden those stairs in the last 10,500 years. Codian gave the distant machines no more than a fleeting glance. He knew almost nothing of the ancient creations, and in truth cared little. All that mattered to him now was victory, however that victory was to be obtained. Here within the cavernous spaces of the crypt, all sounds were amplified and made resonant. The strident cries and prayers of the Astaroth's chaplains and the preachers of the ecclesiarchy resounded through the gloomy depths. Everywhere he looked he came across soldiers busy deploying their heavy weapons or squeezing their bodies into whatever cover they could find. Many of his brother Space Marines had survived this far, and those warriors were scattered amongst the smaller humans, imposing Leviathan's standing head and shoulders above all others. As a chaplain, he felt compelled to stand with those warriors, to raise his Crozius by their side and offer his prayers to their ears, but he knew he could not. Now that the final hour of this war was fast approaching, he suddenly came to realize that there were still so many things he could have done, so many avenues left unexplored. He had cursed this dark future time with all his heart from the moment he had opened his eyes on board the Demiurge's ship, and yet, here, now, he came to realize that there were so many possibilities yet to be explored. This was no reading of the Emperor's Tarot. This was no glimpse of future possibilities. This was the future, his future, and he had not been cursed to endure it, but rather he had been blessed. Past events rolled through his mind unbidden, for he had seen and experienced so much here. More so, he came to realize that this future was more inextricably linked to him than even he could have originally perceived, as events from his past began to coalesce with all he had done here, making more sense than they ever had. He came to understand the mysterious truth of Cypher's existence more than ever, and it was an existence that, like an iceberg, held but its tip in this future time. Even if the forces of life saw victory here, and even if the Citan were defeated, his role was far from over. He understood that now he had taken upon himself the mantle of Cypher, but it was more than an inheritance. The role was his, and had always been his. He was by far the first individual to bear that title, but it was a title that had been created with him in mind. Codion. The psychic call plunged through his mind with power enough to stagger him. It was Ka, and the desperation in his voice was palpable. He slowed and spun on his heel in time to see the lumen haze flicker and dim all around him. The sound of untold tons of stone shattering and falling filled his ears. He looked on as the darkness at the opposing end of the immense crypt peeled away as the void dragon hurled himself into the vaulted chamber. Entire sections of the walls and the ceiling collapsed above and around him as he forced himself into the space, his terrible eyes burning with anger and the desire to destroy. The Necrontyr flooded in like water around his feet, their guns flashing in the gloom. In their haste to enter, many sealed their own fate as the falling masonry crushed hundreds of the machines in seconds. The guns of the defenders opened up almost immediately, and the air within the crypt grew even hotter beneath the onslaught. Gunfire flashed back and forth through the cavernous space, the smoke generated by the exchange swiftly merging with the rolling dust clouds to form a choking shroud. Still, the void dragon's terrible eyes were visible at the heart of it all, their pulsing glow growing slowly larger with the passage of each moment. "This is it," Codion cried, willing his Vox stud to life. "The void dragon is coming. Engage at will. Give your all to bring the BD low. For the Emperor." Those final 3 words served to rally the defenders, and the reply shook the walls of the crypt with its intensity. Bodies surged around Codion as all those present, from man to Astarte and even Xenos, all threw themselves willingly upon the advancing enemy. In all his life, he had never before taken part in a conflict of such intensity. The heat of the exchange and the press of bodies here made the air almost unbreathable. The noise was enough to stagger even a warrior of the Astaroths, for it battered against him in waves, terrible and unforgiving. He turned and fought against the tide, intent on finding the foot of the stairway where he and the others would make their final stand. Once again he found it hard to fall back when so many of the others were advancing to meet the foe, and it was only the knowledge of what was fated to come to pass that kept him on his path. The dragon's terrible roar shook everything around him as he shouldered his way through the press, forced to use every ounce of his strength just to keep moving. Legions of Imperial Guard flowed by, each and every soldier caught up in the passion of the moment. Their teeth bared and their eyes wide with fervor, the guard bore on, their weapons ready and prayers on their lips. Explosions tore through the crowds behind him, close enough to throw out their heat. He knew that good, courageous warriors of the Imperium were dying in huge numbers, but their sacrifices would not be in vain. He knew he was not far from the stairs now, as the press began to loosen slightly. Hulking Praetorians bounded past, screeching their guttural machine code cries as they prepared to meet the enemy. Dreadnoughts shook the ground as they advanced, unafraid and ready to die. The air around and above him burned as the hidden Devastator squads intensified their efforts, ensuring that the enemy paid dearly for every inch they advanced. He felt his boot ring against the first of the ancient steps, then in a second later the crowds parted to reveal the march and the figures waiting there. The Primarches regarded his arrival with a series of curt nods, each one tense and ready for the coming fight. Fingers tightened around weapons in barely contained anticipation, and faces were grim and heavy with determination. Codian bounded up the stairs, clearing them two at a time. It took him little over a minute to reach the waiting sons of the Emperor. It would seem that Xenos and traitor alike were testing, enough so to force our foe to rethink his constitution. Codian lifted his head as he heard the familiar voice, and when his eyes fell on the bruised but determined face of the wolf, he allowed himself a smile. Russ had returned to the fight proper, and just in time to meet the dragon upon the very threshold. Only then did the Primarch's words sink into his mind, and he turned to look upon the ageless commander of the Necrontyr. The Void Dragon's appearance had not altered since he had last laid eyes on the creature, but his size certainly had. Where once the C'tan had been truly immense in size, now he had lost a huge measure of his bulk. Whether this was down to the attentions of the various factions fighting to lay him low as Russ suggested, or indeed more of a personal aesthetic or practical decision based on the constricting arrangement of the chambers, he did not know. He did however seem to be sorely troubled by the combined and concentrated fire pouring into him. Even now, scores of smoldering wounds peppered his silvered form, and though none of them looked severe enough to hurt or even slow him, Codian whispered a silent prayer to the Emperor that the punishment was having some manner of cumulative effect. Codian did not know fear as a normal man, but looking upon the face of the enemy as he did now, he found he could understand it. The Void Dragon was a fearsome sight, a terror to behold indeed. Where once his face had been impassive, now it bore an expression of utter rage transcending anything Codian had ever seen. Anger blazed in the fiend's burning green eyes and flames poured from the C'tan's open mouth. As the dragon advanced, he crashed against ancient support columns, sweeping them aside as if they were less than nothing. The immediate spaces of the chamber had been more than enough to accommodate him, but as he closed upon the stairs, Codian began to see with his own eyes how the determination of the defenders was at last beginning to have an effect on him. Fire poured into the C'tan from every direction. Those about the dragon's feet expended their ammunition in order to add to this, choosing to ignore the lesser threat of the Necrons even as the machines swept into them. Hidden by the gloom and the distance, those secreted within the unseen roosts high above rained death down into the god's shining form. Starbursts of blinding energy flashed across the C'tan's body, erupting like miniature geysers and then dying away as the living metal swallowed them once more. Only the most powerful weapons were able even to produce this result, and even then it was a fleeting victory, but Codian knew in his heart that they were draining the Void Dragon's strength, one tiny measure at a time. Never in his life had Codian been involved in a battle so concentrated as this. True, the sheer scale of these man-made caverns was without compare, but still, given the number of bodies that filled this gargantuan space, he could not help but feel claustrophobic here. The dragon was more like an animal now, thrashing and pummeling at the arches and walls around him in frustration. Beams of shimmering green energy flashed from his eyes to immolate everything and everyone they touched. Unnatural fires spilled from his open maw to consume all those before him, enemy and ally alike. So, it comes to this, said a deep and ancient voice from behind him. Mighty Fukin descended the steps, the ancient stone groaning beneath his weight. He hefted his hammer up in both hands as his glowing eyes regarded the approaching behemoth. Fate draws us to our finest hour, at long last. I would give my all, my last breath, to have my legion here with me, to fight this last great battle at their Primarch's side. Around him, a number of his brothers echoed this sentiment. Like Fukin, fate had decreed that they would face the coming of the C'tan alone, or at least without the support of the legions and chapters descended from them. There were many Astaroths here, that much was true, but save for the wolves of the 13th Company and the mere handful of dark angels, white scars, and imperial fists dispersed thinly through the gathered numbers, there were precious few that belonged to the original legions. Honor the memory of them, brother, Russ said in answer, drawing a particularly huge chain blade and activating the weapon's motor. There will be a reunion when we stand before the Emperor in his eternity. They will know your deeds, my kin, and they will love you all the more for them. There will be more than enough time for lamentation when your body is long dead and the flesh has withered from your bones. While ever there is breath within you, let it not go to waste. For the Emperor! For the Emperor! The Primarchs roared as one. Kodian joined the cry, unable to resist the urge to do so. He punched the air and then thrust his pistols out before him, the dual weapons now more comfortable and familiar to him than any other. The sensation was utterly conspicuous, as undeniable as it was potent. It was a quickening, a sense of finality and resolution. They were here now at the very crux of this war. Beyond them lay the Emperor's throne room and before them, the Void Dragon. There was nowhere left to go. Nothing left to do except for face the C'tan and the Necrontyr here. The fate of the stars themselves rested on the outcome of this conflict, and the weight of that fact did not fail to rest heavily on Kodian's shoulders. Give your all, chaplain, Corax said, his dark eyes burning with determination as he looked upon Kodian. You can do no more than that. Kodian inclined his head in agreement, for the Primarch spoke the truth. Until eternity, my lord, and that final, endless battle. It has been an honor to stand in your shadow. I am humbled by the presence of you all. Corax smiled then and looked away. The thrusters set into his back flared as he brought his mighty chain sword to bear. Dust and stone chips were blasted into the air as the Primarch of the Raven Guard took flight, thrown aloft by the power of his jump pack. Corax's attack proved to be the catalyst that saw the Primarchs come alive. As one they readied their weapons, and charged. Part 232. Legendary. Kodian felt the steps quake beneath him as the Primarchs bounded past, spurred into action by their brother Corax. Russ unleashed a long, guttural howl, giving voice to the fire in his blood. The Khan swept his long cloak aside and bounded from the steps, his leap carrying him all the way to the foot of the march. Manus and Fukin descended the stairs side by side, their combined weight shattering the stone beneath them. Dorn's voice split the air as he mobilized, issuing strident commands to those fists still alive. He drew his blade and charged after his brothers, eager to grasp his share of the glory. The Lion and the Red Giant were the last of the brothers to enter the fray. Johnson cast a lingering glance Kodian's way as he passed by, his ebon blade resonating as it was drawn from its scabbard. Magnus ignited, his towering form becoming wreathed in cerulean flame. His mighty glaive screamed as if alive, empowered by the energies of the warp. There was a finality to the situation that Kodian felt was utterly undeniable. All the forces of the galaxy that opposed the Necrontyr and the C'tan had come together here to deny these ancient monsters ultimate domination, and he was here, at the very zenith of the definitive fight for survival. For as long as he was fated to live, Kodian knew that he could never hope to recognize the sheer quantity of lives lost here on Terra. If it would ever possible for him to spend 1,000 lifetimes scrutinizing the reiteration of this colossal, legendary conflict, he knew he could never hope to see all that had transpired here in the fight to deny the Necrontyr. So many had died just to bring them to this point. Xenos and human, traitor and faithful. All had thrown themselves upon the altar of war and given of themselves fully to disavow and resist this abominable enemy. To die now would stain that sacrifice. To fail after so much genocide and bloodshed had passed would be an affront to existence itself. He would not fail. Kodian felt the rage and the zeal that burned within him intensify, and he allowed it to vent with a long, cleansing roar of determination and denial. The sentient darkness within him responded, fueled by his rage. It boiled within him, coiling around the flames of his emotions, fanning them, augmenting them. Its thirst was his thirst. He and it were as one now, symbiotic and inseparable. Be faithful. Be strong. Be vigilant. The words were but a whisper in his ears and yet were at once powerful and dominating. They ensnared him, body and soul, consuming him for no more than a passing moment. He did not question those words, for they were an echo of a time long since past, made eternal by their sheer power. They were a final command, ingrained into all that constituted Astarte and human alike. They were a legacy and a blessing. For you, my emperor, he intoned, letting the darkness envelop him. Less than a heartbeat later he came to be once more, the sights and sounds of the world around him flooding into his senses once again. The void dragon loomed large before him, vast and terrible. The ancient being radiated absolute power, his aura like some unknown and indescribable sixth sense, or at least a potent amalgamation of the five. As close as he was, Codion was aware of the fiend's presence on every level. His very soul ached in the shadow of the dragon. At his waist the Dawnblade shivered. Corax was the first to engage the star god. Trailing fiery smoke, the father of the Raven Guard descended upon the shining god without fear or hesitation. He threw his arm back and struck the dragon with his chain sword, the blow powerful enough to send waves of concussive force rippling out from the point of impact. The dragon slowed as the blow struck him, his silvered chest shuddering briefly, but did not suffer any lasting harm. No matter the ancient weapon's artifice and superior design, Corax's chainsword could not even hope to withstand the punishment of such treatment. Its thick length shattered beneath the dragon's implacability. The tooth-laden chain unfurled and spun away, striking the dragon's serpentine face as it did so. The dragon swept a clawed hand out and batted the Primarch aside with languid ease, as if no more than annoyed at Corax's presence. The Primarch spun away, the smoke issuing from the thrusters at his back spiraling after him. Russ slammed into the star god with bone-shattering force. He used his final steps to propel him into the air, and his armored paw drawn as a battering ram. He smashed shoulder first into the dragon's face, and such was the force of the blow that the wolf's entire form looked to quiver. His armor quaked, pealing like the bell of some ancient imperial cathedral. The dragon rocked back on his heels, snaking energies coruscating about his bestial face. Russ dropped then onto the balls of his feet and drew his spear back, just in time for the star god to recover enough to realize the wolf's next move. The spear sang as it drove into the liquid metal at the dragon's midriff, its ancient blade shimmering with power. It sank in up to the foot of the blade and then stopped abruptly, unable to slide any further. The air was resonant with power as the sacred weapon struck home, for like many of the truly ancient weapons the Primarches possessed, it was both a holy and a power-driven creation. There were few who existed today, or indeed had ever existed, that knew the truth of such weapons. Like Anaris, like the Primarches themselves, such weapons had been created for this war, although they had not been fashioned by so prehistoric a hand as had the Dawnblade. No matter the legends that surrounded them, they were arms designed and wrought by the Emperor himself, the greatest smith the human race had ever known. The dragon reeled beneath the blow, his reaction far more manifest than most would have expected. Multi-hued light burst about the wound created by the spear as the resonating blade bit deep, for the Emperor in his wisdom had ensured that the weapon had been infused with the pure and raw power of the warp, power utterly lethal to a Citan. The dragon roared and kicked out, its talon-laden foot slamming into the wolf. Russ snarled as he was sent spinning away, more through frustration than any pain. Like Corax before him, he had been turned aside by the star god, but he was far from done. More so, the distraction had proved a success. One by one, the Emperor's faithful sons attacked. Dorn was into the fray next, a blur of golden yellow. He struck his foe again and again, each time altering his position just enough to avoid the dragon's questing limbs. He rolled beneath the star god and came up behind him to strike again. Like Corax, his weapon, however ancient and magnificent, was no more than a principal example of its kind, constructed not by the Emperor's hand but by some long-forgotten artificer of the Great Crusade. The blade rang as it struck the dragon's metal skin, but it did not bite, the necrodermis of the Citan. Proof against virtually any mortal weapon. Dorn cast the sword aside like so much detritus, realizing, in moments, that it could not aid his intentions. Fist replaced blade then, a fitting exchange for Rogel. Dorn. He pummeled the dragon's back, his arms swiftly becoming liquid, blurred by the speed of their locomotion. Each blow threw up a blazing corona of light and sent a violent shiver through the dragon, for it was Dorn's fists themselves that had been blessed by the unfathomable consecration of the Emperor's power. This ends here. The charged voice of Magnus the Red rose to a crescendo, infused with power enough to almost destabilize the structure of the walls around him. The giant burned as he charged, his vast form wreathed in cerulean flame. He held his glaive aloft and the mighty weapon shone with the raw power of the Empyrean, for it was a conduit to the vigor of that other realm as surely as Magnus himself. He channeled that power as he entered the fight, using it to assail the star god with bursts of pure, burning wrath. The red giant roared as he formed spears of hate and cast them into the dragon's writhing torso. Meteors of defiance screamed into being from the upper reaches of the vast march, and spiraled down through the air to swirl around the dragon and crash into him, one after another. Crackling fingers of denial arced into the star god again and again, assailing him from every angle. Each strike reverberated through the fathomless chamber, its impact felt as much as heard. The dragon roared in pain and anger, the very stuff of his constitution agonized by the touch of that which was utterly inimical to him. Codion felt his soul soar as he watched the glorious battle unfold. The last tendrils of darkness were still peeling away from him like dead skin as he stepped into the melee, at once humbled and daunted by those around him. Together, the Primarches were a force to be marveled, a collective that could not fail to inspire awe and wonder in any and all that witnessed them. They set about the dragon like wolves, striking whenever and wherever an opportunity presented itself. This was the battle that had been fated in the stars since the dawn of the Imperium and beyond. This was destiny unfolding, the very stuff of legend. This was the end, that much was utterly undeniable. Codion faltered as he neared the silvered mass of the star god, suddenly aware of just how out of his depth he was here. The Primarches moved and struck like bolts of lightning all around him, almost too swift to be followed by mortal eyes. Russ swept past him and threw himself at the dragon, striking the living metal again and again with his powerful spear. Each strike punctured the writhing material and left behind a rend ablaze with blinding light. He howled, the sound long and mournful. With every strike, as if the souls of all those slain by the dragon were adding their own rage to his. He continued this method of attack for several seconds before the dragon found him. The Citan screamed in fury as he thrust both hands out, clawed fingers spread wide, and caught the wolf in some infernal and unseen grip. The very stuff of reality bent to the star god's will as the dragon forced the molecules around Russ to change, to obey him. Russ froze in mid-attack and the spear was wrenched from his grasp by invisible hands. The wolf gave out a long, lingering howl as the ancient weapon was shattered into 1,000 splintered pieces by the dragon's unmatchable ability to manipulate reality. The distraction allowed Corax, battered and bleeding, to land on the dragon's vast shoulders. His weapon shattered by his enemy's resilient form, he set about the dragon's head with his fists, pummeling him even as he sat down. The Primarch of the Raven Guard cried out for vengeance as he hammered the serpentine head before him with his fists, allowing himself to give in to the rage in his heart. He called the same line of denial over and over again, and the living metal buckled and swam as it fought the pugilistic assault. After a few moments of unrestrained violence, Corax wrapped his arms around the dragon's head and began to tear at his eyes. The silvered skin shivered beneath his fingertips and beams of light speared the gloom. The dragon lifted his talon-laden feet and willed his hulking form backwards through the air. Codion had just drawn the dawn blade from its scabbard when he saw the Citan fly backwards and crash into the huge columns supporting the arched ceiling far above. Both the dragon and Corax disappeared then beneath a billowing cloud of dust and rubble, along with hundreds of writhing defenders and untold numbers of Necrons. "Press on!" Magnus shouted, still ablaze with psychic fire. There can be no hesitation. There can be no quarter. Destroy him. Even as the Red King spoke, he began to tear away huge chunks of stone with his mind. He swiftly forged a path through the rubble, turning stone to dust with a thought. A blood-curdling roar shook the very foundations beneath Kodian's feet then, and the glimmering spark of hope that had ignited within his breast went out. Dust swirled and eddied as the massive form swept out of the choking morass and stepped back into the glow of the chamber. The dragon's eyes blazed with utter determination, just as his metal body blazed with unmatched power. He would not give in. Kodian knew that. He would never concede this fight, this war. He would not falter, not even for a moment, until he saw victory or until, somehow, they destroyed him. The dragon drew his arm back and then hurled something dark through the air. The bulky object rang as it landed slackly and bounced across the ground before sliding to a loose halt at the feet of the gathered Primarchs. Corax Dorn whispered, his quiet voice filled with a mixture of sorrow and disbelief. My brother. For a moment, there was only silence. Corax lay still upon the floor of the chamber, his battered body twisted and broken, his head loose and angled severely. His dark-rimmed eyes were wide open and glassy, the life torn from them. Corax was dead, his life taken by the dragon. Kodian started forward, one hand outstretched. My lord. The lion's arm extended and his huge, armored fingers closed around the chaplain's shoulder guard, allowing him to advance no further. Futile gesture, chaplain. He is gone, but his legacy is evident. Kodian could see that Johnson was right on both counts. The star god was hurt and hurt badly, but the chaplain felt the impact of those words as a physical blow, one that shook him to his core. He felt the disbelief and the rage building inside him and knew then that nothing, not even the mighty, vice-like grip of a Primarch would hold him at bay. Murder. The word left his lips as a long and mournful howl, a primal release of anguish that caused the living weapon in his hand to quake empathically. He willed the darkness into being, his rage fueling the ancient and primal force. The shadows tore him from where he stood and flung him through the oblivion beyond to drive him like a spear into the shadow of the star god. Kodian came to be before the dragon, his heart filled with murder and his mind clouded with wrath. The transfer had been all but instantaneous, faster even than the attentions of a god. The Dawnblade transformed in his grasp, morphing and growing to become the ancient weapon as it had been forged by the hand of Vol. The long curve of its blade shone with ancient azure runes of power and it sang a single, keening note, the sound razor-sharp and haunting. This transformation allowed the Dawnblade's vast power to swell to the fore. The dragon saw the truth of the weapon in an instant and visibly shivered, the reaction primal and ageless. I am Dalo Kodian, and I am the harbinger of your obliteration. Kodian cried, willing every last vestige of strength into the coming strike. The burning eyes of the Void Dragon fell to meet him, at once filled with contempt, hate and a hint of concern. Kodian met the gaze of a god and held it tight. As he swept the Dawnblade across the dragon's shin, the highest point he was able to reach. The Void Dragon screamed, and it was a sound unlike any he had ever heard. It shook him to his core with its power, and it fought to shred his mind like fingers of ice. His vision blurred and his breath caught in his throat. Even Anaris convulsed in his grasp, as if pained by the unholy sound. The entire chamber shook as the Void Dragon reeled, reality itself responding empathically to the inhuman pain. The Primarchs fought to remain on their feet, but even they found this a task too testing to overcome. Galaxy of sensation overwhelmed Kodian then as the Dawnblade tore through the dragon's necrodermis and released the immeasurable energies within. This was an entity that had feasted upon the raw matter of stars, and the very stuff of its form was power beyond the comprehension of most mortals. Kodian fell back and landed hard as the metal skin of the dragon folded back beneath the touch of the Dawnblade. He felt the very matter around him shiver and quake as the star god's molten core found release. For a moment, he looked upon the blinding torrent of escaping energy and could imagine no fate other than death, and then he felt another undeniable force seize him, envelop him even as he waited for death to claim him. Fingers of ancient shadow curled around him and tore him from the path of the questing flares, even as those others unfortunate enough to be present around him were utterly annihilated in his place. "This is not your time, prophet, not yet." Ka's voice reverberated through his mind as he watched himself passing by the charging Primarchs. Everything seemed to be happening in slow motion, as if he was seized and held beyond the natural ebb and flow of time. He looked on in silent helplessness as Russ charged past, his face taut and alive with animalistic abandon. The lion charged into the fray at his brother's side, dour and taciturn, ever calm and calculating in stark contrast to his sibling. The Primarchs engaged the dragon even as he reeled in the face of the grave injury. Darting and slicing, hunting for openings and weak spots whilst at the same time avoiding the flood of escaping energies, the sons of the Emperor threw themselves at their quarry with absolute abandon. Despite his current restraint, Codian saw everything. He saw the beleaguered defenders fall in their droves around and about the titanic battle. Scores were crushed or burned as each second passed, some by the flailing, searing powers of the void dragon but most by the silver tides that served him. So too did untold numbers of the enemy fall. Necrons clattered to the ground like metal rain as the escaping stuff of the dragon washed over them, liquefying all that it did not incinerate. Scores of the unliving warriors looked to attempt to flee, their skeletal forms shimmering with emerald light and hazing, only to be denied. Whether it was of some design by the Void Dragon, or perhaps some other unseen and unknown force was not apparent, but the Necrons found that they were unable to fade away. Hordes of them flickered from sight again and again, only to reappear where they had stood seconds before. The dragon was hurt, that much was evident, and the powerful and enchanted bite of the ancient weapon had rendered the stuff of its living skin unstable. Elemental power spilled from its wound. And it was only the speed and dexterity of the Emperor's sons that kept them from being immolated by the coruscating energies. "It is time," Ka said into his mind. "The blow has been struck, Codian. The weapon has done what it was made to do. Let me go, Ka," the chaplain cried, fighting against the invisible barrier that held him at bay. His own voice seemed amplified, as if audible only within his own mind. "Let me go and I will finish this." "No, Codian. This was never your fight to finish. Your destiny lies elsewhere." Codian would not hear the Old One's words. He thrashed and fought with every ounce of his being. And yet he was only vaguely aware of the fact that his body was held absolutely immobile. Ka himself was unseen, and even as he fought to struggle free, Codian watched as the gathered enemies of the C'tan flowed by him, almost as if they were ignorant to his presence. He felt detached, no longer part of the reality around him. He realized then what was happening. This was it. This was the final moment, the crux of it all. The blow, the execution. The death of a god. Everything seemed to happen in an instant, and yet there were untold events unfolding everywhere around him. The chamber itself became a maelstrom, a swirling, heaving morass of pulverized stone and searing flame, the air thick with debris, blood, and bone. The dragon unleashed his full power as an unmatchable tempest born of utter rage and denial, a primal force of defiance, almost tantrum-like. Ancient walls shuddered and shattered and the endless shadows peeled away as the immense vaulted roof blew into dust, raised and dispelled by the star god. Bodies disappeared in untold numbers as they were swept away by the tsunami of force, crushed, engulfed or simply obliterated by it. Necrons shattered into choking silvered dust, thousands upon thousands of them, rendered into glittering sand by the primordial forces. Everywhere he turned his gaze, Codian caught sight of familiar, desperate faces twisted with determination. Magnus flashed by his vision, ablaze with Sorcerous power. Dorn tumbled past, his armor throwing out sparks as he plowed the ground. There were others here now too, orcs and even Tau, spilling in down the sides of the huge crater in their thousands, their collective roar enough to compress its skull with its scale. Necrons clashed wherever the gathered enemies of the C'tan entered the fray. The scale of it all was immense, and Codian found himself struggling to comprehend what was happening. The Primarchs were still locked in mortal combat with the raging giant, their bodies ablaze with holy light. Something had changed, shifted. It was a completion, a millennial plan. Realized. This is it, Kodian. This is it. He felt fingers of dark, hazy ice curl around his shoulder and was aware of Ka behind him, holding him at bay, protecting him. Although the ancient being did not speak, the chaplain was able to sense his thoughts, or at least his intent. He understood now. He understood what had to happen. His attention held by the efforts of the Primarchs, the Void Dragon paid no heed to the other varied and countless individuals approaching. He did not recognize the ancient light of the Phoenix Lords, those sworn enemies of the Necrontyr. They came like ghosts, weaving through the masses, fluid and untouchable. The one called Bahiroth swept in from the open skies, a dart of iridescent color so fast he moved as a blur. He met the dragon amid a storm of sweeping blows, each impact flashing and shrilling against the star god's mighty form. So fast was Bahiroth that he even managed to arm and thrust a single plasma grenade into the dragon's maw. There was a flash and a low crump as the device detonated, leaving behind not a trace of damage, but then again the attack had never been intended to cause harm. The indignity of it angered the Citan enough to ensure his attention. The Phoenix Lord twisted around the questing claws and flailing limbs to swoop down low, heading towards the blinding, cascading light that spilled from the dragon's leg. The cry of the wind did not slow, instead he speared soundlessly into the searing energy bleed like a dart of lasfire to dash his ancient armored form against it. The primeval armor shattered against the raw energy like glass, disintegrating into millions of glittering pieces. Kodian felt the pressure of the Phoenix Lord's death as an ache at the center of his mind as he witnessed his demise. Constellations of miniature stars cascaded out into the air as the untold souls contained within the ancient Eldar armor were released. They flocked and swirled around the dragon like vengeful wraiths, harrying him with their presence. No more than a second passed when the legions of souls that had resided within Bahiroth swarmed into the blazing mass. Flares of energy backwash rolled through the chamber as the two opposing forces met. The dragon threw his head back and howled, a long and pained sound. Tremors racked his silver form, as if the necrodermis that kept him bound and contained was beginning to grow unstable. Destiny, Kodian. Destiny unfolds. Ka said into his mind. The Old One released him then and the chaplain staggered slightly beneath his own weight. His eyes remained fixed to the events unfolding beyond. The Primarchs continued the desperate fight against the Star God as the rest of the Phoenix Lords joined the fray. Janezar leapt in high, her lithe form twisting and dancing through the air to strike at the dragon's lofty face. The same time Fuegan pressed in below, using his vaunted fire pike to draw ragged lines of molten slag across the Star God's mass. The burning lance added to the searing damage with his fire axe, a truly ancient and powerful weapon. The dancing runes etched into its burning surface writhed as he struck the dragon's legs again and again, each blow cleaving the armor wherever it touched. High above Fuegan the storm of silence landed atop the Citan's shoulders and slashed at the dragon's face again and again with her living spear, screaming as she did so. The dragon swept his vast claws about him in an attempt to ensnare her, but the Phoenix Lord skipped and rolled about the clumsy sweeps, avoiding them with ease. Asuryan and Karandras danced about the dragon's feet, slicing and slashing at their ancient foe. Again and again. As they did so, Magan Ra stood before him and unleashed a storm of flashing shuriken, a torrent so vast that the shining form of the dragon rippled and writhed. Whether the Harvester of Souls was as lithe and swift as his counterparts was unclear, but unlike the rest, Magan Ra made no attempt to evade the dragon's deadly attentions. Even as the Star God loomed forward and made to seize him, he did not flinch. His feet planted firmly on the ground. Either side of him, Magan Ra continued to fire at his foe until the dragon's vast hand enveloped him and plucked him into the air. The Phoenix Lord's skeletal form became enveloped in a cold, blinding light as the dragon crushed him from existence. The Star God opened his maw and screamed, though whether this was through anger or pain Kodian could not ascertain. The noise was long and mournful and terrible, and Magan Ra became a miniature constellation of stars just as his brother Bahurath before him. Kodian saw this and recognized at last what was happening. Both Phoenix Lords had met their end. And in death they had become so much more than they were in existence, for he saw the truth of the Phoenix Lords at last. Each of the ancient Eldar beings were entities that comprised of not one, but untold legions of souls, gathered together for this very event. Even as he watched, Kodian could see that the deaths of the Phoenix Lords had a profound effect on the Star God, much more so than their efforts to harm him in life. Souls shoaled and swam around the dragon's leaking inner energies, and wherever they touched the boundless stuff of the Star God's true form they fought to negate it, for were the C'tan feasted on the primal energies of life itself, the energies of the soul were as poison to them. In any conceivable quantity this energy was nowhere near enough to affect them, but the souls contained within the ancient shells of the Phoenix Lords were truly legion, and more so they were utterly saturated with the raw stuff of the Immaterium. As the dragon staggered in pain, Karandras lunged forward and slashed his claw across his foe's damaged shin. The tear there widened, allowing even more of the contained power to spill free. The Shadow Hunter did not so much as hesitate as he attacked the breach, his power claw and chain sword widening it further. In any other circumstance even the weapons of a Phoenix Lord would have been nowhere near enough to so much as dent the necrodermis of a C'tan, but the damage done by the Dawnblade had weakened the ancient substance there enough to allow it to be manipulated. Karandras stepped into the surging, blinding energies then, and they tore his form apart without hesitation. Souls cascaded from his melting form even as Asuryan, first of the Phoenix Lords, spun his blade around in his grasp and drove it deep into his chest. Janezar leapt from her lofty position and landed at the dragon's feet. Her eyes met with Kodian's for a moment, and she held his gaze as the mounting energies consumed her. He cannot stand against that which he has no defense. Ka said into his mind then. The soul is his enemy, Kodian, as it has always been. The Eldar have always known this. Your Emperor, he knew this also. At first, he was so mesmerized by the unfolding fate of the Void Dragon that Kodian failed to notice the shadow as it fell over him. Only after a few moments did he become aware of the presence of another close by. He turned to see the lion standing over him, his hand outstretched. The Primarch's eye blazed with recognition. Gift, Prophet. Johnson called, forced to raise his voice so as to be heard above the tumult. Kodian recognized the ebony blade immediately for what it was. The lion had unbuckled the scabbard from his belt and he handed it, sword and all, to the chaplain. Kodian took the ancient sword without protest. All the pieces of the puzzle were finally in place now. Though he had held the knowledge of manifest destiny in his mind for a long time, it had been far from ordered. Now that knowledge was sequential. He no longer only knew, now he understood as fully as if he had been born privy to the future of the galaxy. He felt no sadness now. He felt no anxiety or desperation. He knew as surely as anything he had ever known what was to come to pass. Thank you, my lord. He called, drawing the sword into the bubble of protective force that surrounded him and fastening the scabbard to his belt. It has been an honor. I am humbled. The lion held up a hand and shook his head. The corners of his mouth turned upwards in the beginnings of a smile. No need, Prophet. You have my thanks for all that you have done for me and my brothers. Until the past draws us together again, live well. Johnson turned away then, his eyes finding the dragon's flailing form. Kodian started forward, one hand outstretched. My lord, wait. I know, Prophet. Johnson called back, his fists balled in readiness to meet his fate. Tell Steelan this. What is done, is done. His Primarch understands. V.E. Imperator. V.E. Caliban. Johnson lowered his head and drove his heels into the ground. A heartbeat later he became a blur, a line of fluid color drawn between his last position and the coruscating deluge of power bleeding from the dragon's dying form. There followed a blinding flash of light and a thunderclap of deep, percussive sound. Kodian felt the death in his soul. He gasped at it, all that he was reeling in the face of the demise of one so legendary and great. For the rest of his life, the memory of that moment would forever dominate his thoughts. One moment the lion existed, the next he was gone. Had the dragon killed him by any deliberate physical effort, then that death would have little affected him, but the emperor in his wisdom had wrought his sons from the primal stuff of the ether. Like the Phoenix Lords, the Primarchs were as far from simple flesh and bone as any living being in existence. Like the Phoenix Lords, they had not been born but created, and created to be the greatest weapons ever to face the C'tan. In death, dashed against and consumed by the escaping stuff of the Star God, they were utterly lethal, more so than they could ever have been in life. The dragon sensed what was happening to him too late to prevent it. He roared and thrashed like a wild beast, using every ounce of his will and mastery of the physical realm in an attempt to try and prevent his own doom. He threw barriers of physical force in every direction around him, waves of concussive energy that pushed everything away with near irresistible force. The walls of the chamber crumbled and became dust as they were banished, compressed by his will into drifts of pulverized dust. Bodies of every description were compacted together with force enough to render them unrecognizable, but still the Primarchs bore on. Ferrus Manus and Fukin dug their heels into the retreating ground and pressed on, the very surface of their armored bodies beginning to peel and flake away in the wake of the assault. The two brothers linked arms and weathered the storm, side by side, unstoppable in their advance. Dorn and Russ swiftly joined them in their efforts, and thus the pace of their advance was increased. All the while the dragon fought to keep them at bay, but he could not, no matter his best efforts. Slowly but surely he was weakening, his condition made terminal by the deaths of both the Phoenix Lords and the Lion. Of the Phoenix Lords, only Fuegan had survived thus, and now the Eldar joined the Primarchs, adding his own supernatural strength to their efforts. Soon the dragon began to realize that he could not stop the Primarchs in this way, and desperation consumed him. He dismissed the buffeting waves of crushing force and instead lunged forward, intent on engaging his enemies physically. Manus and Fukin thundered forth to meet him, twin behemoths of physical power. The dragon brought his fists down to smash them upon the Primarchs, but both held firm, catching the descending fists and shouldering their weight. Russ bounded forward and slammed his shoulder into the dragon's other shin, fighting to overbalance him. The Khan let out a blood-curdling war cry, crouched low, and then sprang up, his leap carrying him through the air and onto the Star God's silver shoulders. Fuegan sprinted from left to right, drawing ragged lines of glowing damage across the C'tan's body, as Dorn sprinted into the fray in an attempt to add his own weight to Russ's efforts. Together the two brothers heaved with all their might, fighting to topple the Colossus. Beyond them all, Magnus fought his own war, using his vast psychic potential to further destabilize and widen the breach made in the necrodermis of the Star God. Something monumental and catastrophic was happening, Codian could sense that much. Something had begun that could not be brought to an end. As Magnus tore at the ever-widening breach, the dragon shuddered and began to quake, as if losing control of his own functions. The blazing light that spilled from him was now alive with glittering stars, a maelstrom of tiny constellations that swirled and eddied as if alive, for in truth they were in a sense. These were the souls that had resided within the ancient armor of the Phoenix Lords, these and many, many more. These were the souls of the Eldar dead, and with the passing of each moment that tally was added to. The Eldar were still dying in droves all across Terra, and as each unseen death came to pass, the soul storm increased. Codian felt the psychic pressure around him increase as Ka enveloped him all the tighter, no doubt sensing that same buildup of power. Finally, the Void Dragon fell. His silvered form crashed into the ground with an earth-shattering thud, his weight throwing up a cloud of dust and debris about him. The Khan continued to assail his face and neck with vicious stabs and slashes from his tulwar, and now that the dragon had fallen, the others set upon him, raining down punches and kicks and slashes of their own. All around them the world continued to implode. Bodies spilled and flowed like storm tides. Everywhere Codian looked, He saw orcs and Tau alike crash into a sea of Necrons at the very furthest reaches of the chamber, where the obscene forces that had been unleashed had dislodged millions if tons of rubble and thus created a colossal ramp deep into the mountainside. Flying craft of every faction and description choked the skies above, exchanging vast lattice works of deadly fire. Burning bodies rained from above and blood flowed ankle-deep around him. This was hell, he knew that. This was the apocalypse. This was the end. Mighty Ferrus Manus gave out a mechanical roar of anger and frustration as he was hoisted high into the air, enveloped by the dragon's vast talons. Codian caught sight of the exchange just in time. There followed a flash of emerald and a vast blurred shape landed upon the dragon's wrist. Fukin raised his hammer and smashed it down upon the dragon's metal flesh with force enough to all but sever the limb. The tortured necrodermis swam and flexed as it fought to counter the damage, and this was enough to see Manus released. The father of the Iron Hands fell from the star god's grasp and landed before the energy bleed. Without pause or consideration, Manus lowered his silvered head, thrust his metal hands forth and stepped into the breach. The soul storm swam around him, almost as if to welcome him. The energy flared all the more brighter, if only for a brief moment, and Ferrus Manus was utterly consumed. The dragon gave out a cry of pain and desperation that shivered the very air. Codian felt the outburst hit him even despite the protection of Ka. It was like being punched at the molecular level. It blurred his vision and agitated every fiber of his being. He caught sight of both Fukin and Dorn as they forged their way towards the breach, a struggling, writhing Magog held fast in their shared embrace. Thunder assailed his ears and an immense psychic pressure compacted his skull. It took him several moments to realize that this pressure was the psychic voice of Magnus, omnipresent and undeniable in its power as he prayed, repeating the same line over and over again. "Receive them, my father. Receive their souls. Receive them, my father." It came then in an instant. There was no sound and yet it was deafening, no light and yet it blinded him. He could see or hear nothing in that instant, and yet he knew that everything had changed in one swift, violent, and utterly legendary moment. It was a death scream so absolutely immeasurable in its scale that his senses could simply not comprehend it. Everything was of the purest white, as if reality itself had been scoured away in an instant. The silence was deafening, heavy and suffocating. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist. "Is it over? Is it done?" His voice echoed infinitely, the only sound to exist anywhere in this new and desolate realm. He did not truly know whether he had survived the conflict or if this was the limbo that followed the death of the physical form. "Ka? Speak to me, O Old One. What has happened here? Has the Void Dragon fallen?" Again, his questions were met only with silence save for the sound of his own echo. He felt frustration beginning to rise within him at this newfound isolation. Only after a few long, tense moments did a familiar voice once again invade his thoughts, and when it did it seemed to come from some incredible, immeasurable distance, as if Ka himself were somehow far away and on the verge of oblivion. "It is done, Codian. Dr. Octyr is no more. The Void Dragon is destroyed." Part 233. Aftermath. His was a rebirth into hell. Whatever unknowable sorceries had held him fast away from harm now peeled away at his behest, folding back end over end until he was spat out into the suffocating morass of death and desolation that followed the death of the Void Dragon. Codian drew in a long, shuddering breath as he fought to support his own weight. He was on his hands and knees, and in spite of the enhancing properties he felt almost too weak to stand. It took a supreme effort of will just to push himself up onto his feet. He felt as if his body had been drained of the very spark of life that sustained his existence. Desolation. Utter desolation surrounded him, stretching away in every direction as far as the eye could see. Where the Void Dragon had stood moments before, there was nothing to be seen of the Citan. Smoke and choking dust drifted through the air all around him. The bodies of the dead littered the ground in their thousands, in some areas piled high on top of one another. Everything was covered in a film of fine silver dust, and there was nothing to be seen of the hordes of Necrontyr that had occupied this place minutes before. "Emperor, have mercy on us all," Codian whispered, genuinely aghast at the scale of devastation. "On some of us, perhaps, but not all. Some of us are far beyond mercy." Codian turned as he heard the familiar voice, and his eyes fell upon the crimson giant standing opposite him. Magnus' single eye radiated sadness. His golden armor was battered and buckled. His cloak of brilliant feathers blackened and made bare. He looked away from Codian in order to survey the wretched scene, lost in his own unfathomable thoughts. Codian could not help but feel the full weight of the horror of this aftermath as it soaked slowly into his soul. The Void Dragon was dead, at least if the suddenly absent Ka was to be believed, and even if this was true, then the victory felt like a hollow one to him. Here and now, standing as he was amidst a veritable ocean of the dead, he could allow himself to feel no triumph, no relief or jubilation. He had watched with his own eyes as the Primarchs, the very sons of legend, had given their lives in order to see the Void Dragon destroyed. Although he fully understood that this had been a necessary course of action, he could not fail to feel the misery of their loss. So many of those he had counted as colleagues, as brothers even, had fallen in this war, and still it was far from over. He knew he could allow himself no time to mourn or to reflect on what had passed, for there was still so much to do before this war was won. "Do you feel that?" Magnus asked him. He looked to the Primarch and saw that stood with his crimson features raised, as if to feel the sun, and his single eye closed. His hands were outstretched, and his fingers flexed slowly. "Tell me, Codian, do you feel its caress upon your skin and in your mind?" He draws it in, imbibing of those last, lingering vestiges. At that he opened his eye and looked to Codian, and the chaplain saw that the Primarch's pupil swam with silvered iridescence. Mafaran feeds upon the carrion energies of his brother's demise. His wish has been realized. Is there any way we could have prevented him from doing so? Codian asked. Just as he had feared. Magnus shook his head. No. He is more powerful now than he has ever been. He is the last of his kind now, and he knows that there is no other entity at large in this universe powerful enough to deprive him of that title. Magnus lifted his gaze then and stared out into the smoke-filled distance. Although the expanse beyond was such that the naked eye could never hope to cross it, Codian knew that Magnus' gaze was centered on the chamber that had once been both the Emperor's throne room and his prison. Does it truly matter, Primarch? Will this prevent us from destroying him? It will not. Magnus answered. Nothing can save the deceiver from the fate that awaits him now. Codian could sense the conviction in the Red King's voice, but so too was he aware of how weary Magnus sounded now. For such a being as a Primarch to display signs of what must resemble fatigue was a clear indication of how much the battle with the Void Dragon had drained them all, and Codian dared not even begin to contemplate how much they had already lost. All was desolation and ruin, and a pall of acrid smoke hung over everything. Because of this it was difficult to see more than perhaps 50 meters in any direction, and so Codian was unable to discern who else amongst the Primarchs had survived. He could hear the guttural roars of the orcs drifting through the hot air, and the sound of Tau weaponry was unmistakable. There were still Necrons to be destroyed here, but the main heart of the enemy force had been torn from its breast. He felt the weight of the sword hanging by his side then, as if the recollection of its acquirement had given the weapon weight and substance. The sword had been a parting gift from the lion, and now Johnson was gone, having made the ultimate sacrifice in order to bring about the dragon's destruction. The chaplain recognized both the symbolism and the practicality of the gift. The blade was precious to him and would remain so in the days and years to come. The memory of its obsidian perfection hung frozen in his mind, and he knew that he would not draw the weapon from its scabbard again, not until it was time for history to repeat itself. Memories of a man named Skarn and the Proscriptus Rex ran through his mind, and he found himself fighting the birth of a bemused smile at the sheer absurdity of it all. Time, such a delicate and complex force that he could never hope to begin to understand it. Time was a concept even the Citan has failed to master, for they could not understand that which they had no mastery over. So much of the outcome of this war hinged upon manipulating the natural order of time. Indeed, even considering all that had changed and all that was destined to do so, because of this manipulation threatened to give him a headache. Better that you do not linger on such things, chaplain, Magnus said. Codian looked to the Primarch, and saw that his eye glittered with white and azure light. Your aura bleeds the confusion in your mind. We cannot allow ourselves to pause in what must be done, not even for a moment. Those of us who survive this shall find time enough to grieve and to ponder when we are done, some far more so than others. Codian heard the sadness in the Primarch's voice and he understood why. Still, the Void Dragon was gone now, and somewhere in the unseen distance the last of the Citan awaited his fate. Brothers. Codian heard the Primarch utter that single word and his breath hung frozen in his lungs. Though Magnus had but spoken one word, the chaplain somehow knew. He looked first to the hulking, smoke-wreathed form of the Red Giant, and then to the spot where Magnus' single eye was fixed. Several hulking shapes cut through the choking gloom, their outlines sharpening with each step. Codian looked on in silent wonder as the shapes slowly revealed themselves. It was a sight more wondrous than any he had ever seen. Guilliman. Rabut Guilliman. Primarch of the Ultramarines. Gene Father. He was a magnificent sight, as breathtaking and soul-igniting as any vision could be. Codian looked upon his Primarch and knew then that this individual was genuine. Every atom in his body sang with joy at the sight of such a phenomenal being. Twin brothers walked alongside Guilliman, Primarches both, and Codian recognized the pretender to Guilliman's left, his features already in the process of altering back to their original form. He fought with all his resolve to take in those around Guilliman but found that he could not, for the Primarch's visage was a beacon he could not ignore. Guilliman came to a halt before him and lowered his gaze so that their eyes met. He took in the sight of Codian, his fathomless eyes assessing every inch of the chaplain. Codian felt compelled to fall to one knee, but Guilliman caught him even as he attempted to do so. With a soft shake of the head he raised Codian back up so that he was standing once more. No, my son. You will not kneel before me. You will stand as an equal. My lord, Codian whispered, forcing the brace of words from his throat as if the effort of doing so was the greatest test of his life. Again Guilliman shook his head. There is nothing you need to say, Dalo Codian. Know this, that I am as proud of you as I have been of any of my sons, for you have shown what it is to be an Ultramarine. Through your actions you have helped to steer this war to its zenith. At that he looked beyond Codian to where his brother Magnus stood, observing the proceedings in silence. Codian felt a charge in the air as the two shared an intense and lingering connection, as if the brothers were somehow communicating on some profound and unknown level. After several tense moments of deep silence, Magnus inclined his head, the gesture utterly measured and protracted. Then, without a single word, he turned towards the smoky horizon and began to walk. Guilliman looked back at Codian and once more ensnared him with his gaze. We all know what must be done, Codian. So many have given their lives so that we may reach this point, and now, at last, we are here. It is time for us to end this. It is, my lord. Codian answered. I will do what must be done. Indeed, therein lies the paradox. Guilliman answered with a muted smile. The father of the Ultramarines said no more. He turned to face the direction of Magnus' departure and began to walk. By his side, Alpharius and Omegan bowed their heads to Codian and followed without so much as a word. He watched as the four Primarches advanced side by side into the smoke, brothers reunited. Whatever had passed between these figures of legend was forgotten now, perhaps not for all time, but at least until this war was over. His gaze remained fixed upon the mountainous back of Rabut, Guilliman, his Primarch, and Gene Father. What manner of wonder would have held him fast and immobile had he encountered Guilliman? Under any other circumstances, he wondered. Even as he considered this, Codian found himself marveling at just how totally this war had changed everything he had ever believed in. It did not matter how this conflict ended. Existence itself had changed beyond recognition, enough so to shatter the mightiest minds. What manner of circumstance had enabled him to endure these changes without losing his sanity, Kodian did not know. Brother. Kodian heard the voice and turned to look into the eyes of a warrior he had known longer than any other here in this blighted time. Umbras. The apothecary smiled. His once pristine white armor was buckled and torn in dozens of places, and smeared with blood and grime. He looked as if he had endured hell the likes of which most mortal men could not imagine. Indeed, Kodian had seen Astaroths who had weathered less and fallen. Neither ultramarine uttered a word as they embraced, shoulder to shoulder, fists clasped together. The exchange was brief, and as they parted Umbras looked his bother up and down. I barely recognize you from the warrior you once were, chaplain. Umbras uttered, though the comment was free of malice or disdain. You have changed so much since the Guilliman's wrath that I hardly recognize you. And you, my brother, have not changed at all. Kodian answered. Of all of us, you alone have weathered this ordeal and stayed true to your origins. You are more of an ultramarine than any of us, Umbras, and in that respect I envy you. Nonsense, Umbras began. Kodian held up a hand in order to stay his brother's tongue. Hear me, brother, and know that I speak the truth. Look at what I have become. You alone have survived this war and yet remained exactly what you were. You alone stand testament to the ideals of our beloved Primarch. You are the epitome of what it is to be an ultramarine. You are the legacy of our chapter, Umbras. Never forget that. Umbras absorbed all the chaplain had to say and eventually came to accept it with a slow nod of the head. I am humbled by your words, Kodian, but you speak as if you are no longer a son of Ultramar. There are two of us still. Kodian smiled sadly as he heard this and patted the hilt of the sword at his waist. I am no longer the man you knew. I am more than I ever was, but that transformation has taken away all that was once Dalo Kodian. He laid a hand upon the fading white you painted upon his shoulder guard, his eyes filled with sadness and regret. Soon every last vestige of livery will be gone from this suit of armor. I am a chaplain of the Ultramarines no longer. Then what are you? Umbras asked, the lines upon his leathered face creasing further. Who are you? That, my brother, is a question I cannot answer. Kodian admitted. Whatever it is that I have become, it has no true name, no true identity. I have sacrificed all I was so that I could become the warrior you see before you, and it is a transformation that can never be reversed. You are the prophet. That is as good an identity as any. Both Astaroths glanced around at the same time at hearing the gruff yet familiar voice. Battered and bloody, naked from the waist up, Thurgus Grungy emerged from the surrounding smoke, a host of Tau warriors following in his wake. The demiurge smiled as he laid eyes on Kodian, revealing several fresh gaps in his teeth. I am sure your clan will mourn you in time, Stockleg. By the ancestors, but they probably do so already. Grungy marched past Kodian in order to follow in the footsteps of the Primarches. As he did so he slapped the chaplain on the leg. Remember, you are already dead, Longshank, at least in the eyes of those you left behind. Now, if you have mourned your own loss sufficiently, then I suggest you fall into step and follow me. There is a golden-skinned starsucker awaiting your ministrations beyond this place. Come, we have story to make. He does have a point, Umbras said with a smile. Plus. Kodian held his breath as he stepped into the chamber, the bright golden light shining from within, warm and tingling against his skin. Familiar figures turned to regard him as he arrived, all silent, perhaps even apprehensive. Everyone here was familiar to him, and as he took his place within the gathering he regarded each of them in turn. Guilliman. Alpharius. Omegan. Magnus. The surviving Phoenix Lord, Fuegan. Grungy, who had arrived but moments before him, beckoned him in and moved to stand by his side. Even as he did so he was barely able to tear his gaze from the shining abomination seated before them all. Prophet. T-last. The voice was ancient and dry, like the primeval winds of creation. The chamber resonated with its Power, the air charged and hot. Kodian could feel the presence of the being in his every molecule, as if this monster before him was somehow a sentient part of the very spark of life that existed in all living things. There was a sense of calm within the chamber that was the absolute polar opposite to the chaos and melee of the war. It was as if that chaos dared not penetrate this most holy of sanctums. At least, it had once been that. Now it was stolen, debased by the presence of the fiend that sat upon the massive golden throne at its center. Once this had been the emperor's most private sanctum, that, and his tomb, if truth be told. Now it belonged to the being known as Maferan, the last of his kind and the most powerful being in this existence by a long way. Kodian looked upon the entity known as the Deceiver and knew then, in that very instant, that there was no weapon capable of destroying him in this universe. There were weapons capable of wounding him, of course, such as the ancient, sentient Anaris, but there was no force or power capable of destroying him save for that of the Empyrean. That, and one other, purer force, more potent than any other. The Deceiver's blazing eyes regarded him as if he were no more than the merest morsel waiting to be devoured. He could feel the hunger radiating from the thing, insatiable and immeasurable as it was. Once the Deceiver had been the weakest of his dwindling kind, but now he was more powerful than any Citan had ever been. The chamber itself groaned and distorted as if struggling to accommodate a being of such utter power. Every rule of physics Kodian was aware of seemed tested at the least in the presence of the Deceiver. The chaplain's every sense railed against what his mind insisted to be the truth. The Citan before him was more monstrous than anything he had ever encountered before. It was a force of utter power and he could not help but feel absolutely insignificant in its presence. You have come, all of you. The cycle is almost complete. The Deceiver's voice was a presence all of its own, far more than simple sound could ever be. Every syllable sent waves of suffocating force pulsing through the chamber, and though it was far from raised to any intolerable level, all those present to hear the star god speak were hard-pressed to weather the rolling waves of force. Maferan regarded each of the gathered beings before him in turn, wry amusement apparent in his blazing eyes. Molten power bled and ran from his metal form like wax, as if the ancient necrodermis that held his substance in check was no longer powerful enough to do just that. The cycle is almost complete, as you say, monster. You are the last one of your kind left. You are all that remains for us to destroy, and this war is ended. A rolling, thunderous laughter split the air of the chamber at this, resonant enough to quake the ancient walls. All those present raised arms up to faces and leaned their bodies forward in order to weather the mirth of the star god. Laugh all you like, Ancient One. Your arrogance will be your undoing. Kodian shouted, unsure even whether his voice would be heard. None of the others had even spoken since they had arrived here. And as each moment passed, Kodian became more and more aware of the fact that it seemed as if he was now the unofficial speaker for the gathering. After what seemed like a protracted period of time, the Deceiver's display of mirth ceased and he settled back in the vastness of the throne, his clawed fingers softly caressing the armrests beneath them as if the thing was his most prized possession. The boundless optimism of the hopelessly lost. I could never tire of it, Kodian. It adds a certain spice to the flavor of the delicate morsels you are. Here we are at this juncture, the war ended and my kin slain. I hold power the likes of which these stars have never seen, prophet. I am absolute in my superiority. I have seen into all the truths of this reality, I have scrutinized every possibility with a precision you cannot comprehend, and I say this to you with utter certainty. You cannot win. You cannot best me. There is no power in this existence that you can wield with a view to destroying me. Delo Kodian. As he spoke, Maferan did so with utter conviction, his every word bolstered by the certainty of one who knew the absolute truth of things. The Deceiver's monstrous face was split with an impossibly wide inhuman smile. I see that you have no rejoinder. Perhaps the truth is at last beginning to soak into your heart. Ah! But if I could only gift you with but a fraction of my essence, Kodian, that you could experience all that I am able to experience. Would that you could taste this war, even in its dying stages, you would know what it is to be like me. So much death, so much sweet, nourishing release. I look out beyond you now to see all that still transpires, and I am pleased. Your armies lie dashed to pieces, monster. Guilliman snarled, the metal that sheathed his fists groaning as he tightened them. The deceiver glanced in the direction of the Primarch and raised a hand. Guilliman gave out a pained snarl and fell onto his knees, his armor groaning and squealing, as forces beyond mortal understanding manipulated it relentlessly. Be silent. The fate of the Necrontyr is of no concern to me. They have served their purpose and I care nothing for their destiny. I have achieved all I need. You have achieved nothing, idiot creature. Codian said defiantly. This snatched the deceiver's attention, and for the first time he saw the mask of mirth slide from the star god's face. The deceiver reached out just as he had done with Guilliman, but paused, his eyes narrowing. Codian felt the Dawnblade shift softly at his side. Fleeting look of recognition passed over the star god's face and then was gone. He lowered his hand, as if deciding that Codian was worthy of some other fate. Do not seek to antagonize me, Dalo Codian. There are some fates far worse than death. Death, abomination, is not a fate as final as you may think, came the chaplain's reply. Slowly but surely, the amusement began to return to Maferan's golden features. The light behind his skin pulsed and blazed all the brighter, as if the display was somehow intended to impress or terrify those present before him. I am nothing if not gracious in that I have allowed you all time to preen and posture before me as thanks for your aid in dispatching my kin. My patience, however, wears thin. It is time that you were all rendered one last service for your new god. No. All eyes turned to Codian as he spoke. He stepped forward and drew an arras from its scabbard at his waist. The weapon's current form was that of his old Crozius, and the weapon sparkled and glowed, as if illuminated by some internal light. While ever we exist, we will fight you. You will not win this war. And still you remain defiant. I tire of this now, the deceiver said. So do we, Codian replied. You see, you still fail to comprehend the fact that you are fated to fail. You still refuse to see the truth of your demise, even though it has been staring you in the face all this time. Maferan stared at the weapon, the look upon his face a mixture of disdain and incredulity. After long moments he pointed to an arras. That? You threaten me with that? Threaten? Codian answered with a shake of his head. No. I do not threaten to do you harm with this weapon. I will destroy you with it, and that is no threat, you arrogant, golden-skinned BD. After everything that has happened, still you fail to see the pattern behind it all. My heart has long ached with the fear that you would at some point uncover one or more of the strands that connect the events that have led us all to this point in time. I see now that my fears were unfounded. You really are as blind as you are stupid. The star god's eyes widened impossibly at hearing this, and his fingers dug deep into the throne's golden arms. I will tear you apart, prophet. Tom by Adam. No, you will not, Codian replied. Don't you see? Fate has caught up with you. Don't you recognize this weapon I hold? Don't you see Nares for what it is? Nares, the deceiver whispered, echoing the chaplain. That, a sheen of ghostly light slid over the weapon in Codian's hand that sent a ripple out across the chamber. Unknown powers beyond any mortal ken threw back the unnatural cowl that had kept the weapon's true identity hidden. The deceiver gave out an echoing gasp as this occurred. His gaze became fixed to an arras, as if he were seeing the weapon for the first time. No. That should not be here. Its presence makes no sense. It should not be here. It is past. It is gone. This time it was Codian's turn to smile. Last, he uttered, holding out the gleaming weapon as if the sight of it was enough to slay the star god. Last, you begin to see. You will never strike me with that thing, Codian. I would kill you before you had even the chance to flinch. You are too late, Inger. Fuegan whispered, his voice layered and resonant as if spoken by 1,000 tongues. The blow has already been made. You are destroyed. The deceiver gave out a roar of primeval rage and thrust a hand out in the direction of the advancing Phoenix Lord. Blinding, blazing power cascaded from the limb and washed over the ancient being. Fuegan spread his hands out by his sides and welcomed the maelstrom, as if he had fully expected it. Armor that had been ancient when mankind had first walked upon Terra melted away and became nothing in an instant. Glittering constellations of stars spiraled upwards, the souls of those countless warriors that had worn the mantle of Fuegan rising up into the shadows of the chamber as they were released. I am Mephiran. The star god bellowed, his voice quaking the chamber with the force of an earthquake. There is no foe I cannot conquer. There is nothing I cannot destroy. You have not destroyed Fuegan, star god. Codian shouted over the tumult. You have created something else. Indeed, the cyclone of souls that twisted and swam far above their heads was still present and seemed as if it was not about to dissipate. Instead it began to spread and intensify, gaining strength and mass at the passing of each second. A ghostly mist looked to seep from every shadow into the chamber, and that mist was drawn into the spirit morass. Whispered voices began to fill the air, distant and ethereal yet growing louder at the passing of each moment. Although those voices were almost too unintelligible to understand, one word was repeated by the spirits over and over again. That word becoming more coherent as the ghostly storm gained ever more strength. Ennead. Part 234. Ennead. How absurd, Codian began, to think that you are supposed to be a being possessed of an ultimate knowledge, a knowledge bolstered by the accumulation of eons of logic, facts, and information, and yet you did not see this fate coming. A being of ultimate intelligence that allowed blind stupidity to seal its fate. Rage began to build behind the deceiver's eyes as he listened to the chaplain's taunts. The air and the ground around him shuddered as if in fear, yet the chaplain was not so moved by the display. Instead he took a single step forward, the Dawnblade still held before him. I am sure that you are aware of every legend that has ever been told abroad these stars. I am sure that you know the name of Ennead. Codian gasped then even as he spoke the name, for the air in the chamber thinned almost to nothing. Before him the deceiver smiled, clearly responsible for the atmospheric manipulation. After a few seconds the air became breathable again at the behest of the star god, and Codian understood that the gesture had been intended to put him in his place rather than cause him any lasting harm. I am aware of that name, Codian. Ennead, the birth of death. The last god. The Eldar gave this entity many names, all of which are inconsequential. I understand, you see. I see the apparent significance behind the demise of the one named Fuegan. Therein lies the irony, Codian. Tell me, are you finally able to grasp this? I know. I have always known. Destroy the Phoenix Lords and awaken Ennead. How unequivocally droll. Codian did not respond to this revelation except for a slight narrowing of the eyes. Still he held the Dawnblade out before him, as if the very presence of the ancient weapon would somehow serve to terrify the deceiver into submission. All the while the star god continued to look on, as a wolf would regard a host of lost and frightened children. I confess, I had hoped for something a little more grand, especially given the effort spent in attempting to misdirect my attentions. Still, perhaps I was mistaken in attributing you all with the level of intelligence required for such subterfuge. It is a mistake I shall be sure not to repeat. Indeed, it is a mistake that will soon prove to be impossible to replicate, given your collective impending demise. Your self-worship is pathetic, Citan. Codian answered, disdain heavy in his voice. Mephiran merely shrugged, a distinctly human gesture, almost as if intended to mock him. It is no personal flaw to recognize one's worth, Codian. Why deny my own superiority? You may well see a flaw of arrogance or conceit, but you cannot deny that I am supreme amongst these stars. I have won, Codian. I am victorious. I have seen my kin exterminated, and now I alone hold the key to ultimate power. The prize is mine, and that prize is the galaxy and all it contains. Why struggle against that, Codion? Why try to deny the inevitable? I suppose that it is human nature to hold hope, even when that hope is clearly futile. I will not begrudge you that defect. Codion exhaled deeply and turned to look at the others gathered behind him. He had expected it, least that one or more of the more vocal members of the gathering would have spoken out against the abomination, but as yet, he had been the only one to speak. He saw the truth behind this then. Each one of the Primarchs quivered gently where he stood, eyes glaring hatred at the star god. It took him a moment to realize that they were being held immobile, against their will, the deceiver's influence upon the material realm such that he was able to manipulate them thus. He also realized that the only reason he was able to move and communicate still was that the C'tan willed it so. I see, he said quietly, turning back to face the arrogant entity. I see it now. I realize my own significance. Smile of triumphant glee spread slowly across the deceiver's face. Last. I knew you would, Codion. You are after all one of the more intelligent examples of your kind. Where is your ally, the one named Ka, now? He cowers in the shadows of the far realm, leaving you to face this final humiliation alone. Where is your emperor, the ancient one who wears his falsehood as a mantle of hope? Where is that final, glorious triumph you expected, Codion? Where is victory? I cannot best you. Codion answered matter-of-factly. I know that and you know that. He held out the Dawnblade, the skull-topped head of the weapon glinting in the glow emanating from the deceiver's golden form. This weapon is the only tool capable of doing so. And yet you could never hope to reach me in time in order to use it. The deceiver smiled. Once. Perhaps, before I drank deep of the essence of my kin, but not so now. This moment is the crux of a scheme that has been millennia in the making, Prophet. I know you see that now. Do you still think that it is mere coincidence that this throne you have so worshipped predates even your emperor? Do you think it coincidence that it is constructed of the same material as the skin I wear? Do you believe that mere chance brought the device here, to this very chamber? You cannot comprehend what has passed before you existed, Codion. You cannot know the full history of this war. Hearing this, it was Codion's turn to smile, the gesture faint but clearly recognizable. How ironic your words, M'Faran. If only you knew. You see, it is the past that shall prove to be your ultimate undoing. Enough. The single word swelled like a hurricane from the star god's lips. Codion lurched back, as if blown through the air on some terrible gale. He landed hard on his back but rolled smoothly onto his knees, and came up, as defiant and unbowed as ever. I tire of your inability to see the truth, damn you. This ends now. Above the chaplain the swirling soul morass began to spiral downwards, heading for the living weapon in his hand. Countless souls thundered into the crackling Dawnblade, filling it, energizing it. The weapon looked to swell beyond its natural proportions, its outline hazing and pulsing. The deceiver gave out a malevolent chuckle. The tool of my demise. The portal that shall deliver the waking god Ennead unto my essence and thus end me for all time. Strike then, Codion, and put an end to all this. Destroy me. I dare you. For long moments Codion stood still, his eyes radiating hatred and the intent to kill. Then, slowly, he lowered the shimmering weapon, his limbs loosening and the hate leaving his gaze. I am no fool, M'Faran. I know that you would tear me to atoms the moment I moved to attack you. I know that I have no chance of reaching you to strike with this weapon. I would not humiliate myself by even trying. With that the weapon ceased to pulse and glow. Codion Imply placed the Dawnblade back in its scabbard at his hip, much to the mounting displeasure of the deceiver. Then your presence no longer amuses me, the star god answered. He raised his fingers as if to command the death of the chaplain with but a gesture, but Codion held up a hand. Wait. Before you kill me, perhaps you would wish to understand how it is that we have already destroyed you. I am sure by now that you have realized the throne upon which you sit is in fact destined to be your tomb. The C'tan's eyes narrowed but he did not speak. The emperor found it, did he not, beneath the ancient sands, an artifact older than this world's ability to sustain life. He saw the truth of its purpose and he took it. He modified it. You see, once activated, the throne was designed to hold on to its subject for all time, to feed from him, to utterly consume him. Millennia ago you saw him find the throne and you saw him defeat Draktyr, and you knew that you would not be able to best him, not without the power of your kin. You played your own part in creating the schism that would see the Imperium torn apart and the Emperor's body shattered. I knew that they would place him on the throne, yes. The arrogant fool could not have known what lay in store for him. He did know, Mepharan. He knew that you had agents amongst the Mechanicum even then, and that you had your agents destabilize the delicate mechanism of the throne so that over time it would start to weaken what was left of him. The warp entity men called Tsiank, it tried in vain to stop me. The deceiver continued, throwing a nod in the direction of Magnus, who, like his brothers, was still held immobile. It sent that one through the webway in an attempt to bring ruin to the mechanism. Had its plan succeeded, then we would not have reached this juncture. The star god of course referred to the event that had led to the very damnation of the Thousand Suns, when Magnus the Red had torn his way into the ancient webway itself in order to breach the otherwise impenetrable defenses of the imperial palace. His plan had been to warn the emperor of the betrayal of his brother Horus. Kodian could not help but shiver as he recalled the legends of his Imperium's first darkest hour. He knew, Citan. The chaplain repeated, his lip curling into the beginnings of a snarl. You think he took to the throne in ignorance, but you are wrong. He did so despite that knowledge, because he knew that you would come for him here. The emperor knew that he needed to draw you here so that he could see his plans realized. You are trapped, you have been ever since you took that seat. And yet you are so blinded by ignorance that you have failed to realize the truth. What is this? The star god snarled, growing ever more angered and impatient. Where moments before his tone had been dominated by conceit, now it was laden with contempt. Is this the desperation of a creature that knows it cannot win? I had thought better of you, Kodian. Dismiss my claims if you must, Citan. Prove me wrong. Rise from your throne and show me my error. The deceiver looked to glow brighter at this, his outline hazing and running fluid. He did not reply to the chaplain's challenge. Nor did he rise. Prove me wrong. Kodian said again, his voice low and menacing this time. You, who holds all the power in the cosmos. Rise and strike me down. What have you done to me? Mepharan hissed, his powerful voice quaking with inhuman rage. Kodian knew then that the star god had come to realize his entrapment. Indeed, so utterly determined to hold on to the golden throne as he had been, the Citan had not once even attempted to rise since he had taken his prize. Only now had he begun to realize his predicament. This is impossible. There is no logical or conceivable way. Accept it, you thrice-damned Star Eater. You are done. You have been bested. The moment you took the Emperor's throne as your own, you condemned yourself to incarceration. The moment you destroyed the last of the Phoenix Lords, you condemned yourself to destruction. And so my corporeal shell is held fast by the machinations of this device. The deceiver answered, settling back into the embrace of his golden prison. Congratulations. You have succeeded in capturing little save for the skin I wear. Do you realize that I am able to cast this skin off with but a thought? Do you have any idea what it truly is to be a Citan? Kodian did not answer. Instead he advanced, crossing the silent space between them so that he was standing mere feet away from the star god, one hand ever resting upon the weapon at his waist. For a lingering moment the two beings locked stares, Kodian ever defiant in the face of the abomination. The deceiver radiating an unmatchable detestation for the warrior before him. I understand enough. Kodian finally said. I understand that you could escape, but to do so would mean the loss of your coveted trophy. He indicated the throne with a flick of his hand. It would mean an end to this war, at least in its current incarnation. It would mean retreat, and you have worked too hard to get to this point only to let it slip away. It is that very same capacity for unlimited pride that has made this victory possible and condemned you to destruction. Enough, the deceiver began. Kodian immediately felt the reality around him change, shift and swell, as if something vast and terrible was about to occur. Despite this, he smiled, and it was a smile of realization, of final and unequivocal satisfaction. Yes, enough. This must end now. I just wanted to see the look on your face when you came to realize what it is I truly hold. I do not need to strike you, Ma-Fei-Ran. I do not need to strike you, for I already have, and yet I have still to do so. Therein lies the paradox, the one aspect of existence that you were never fully able to understand. Time. Do you feel it within you now, the seed of your destruction? Do you remember that which is yet to come for me but has already occurred within your past? At that he slid the Dawnblade free of its holster once again and held it before the Star God. The living weapon shuddered softly and then began to swim within Kodian's hand, as if it were made of liquid. It altered its appearance so as to take on its original form, growing and elongating into the long-blade falchion of Eldar origin. Naris. The Dawnblade. Who knows just how many guises this weapon has been forced to assume since its creation? Who knows what strange and alien forms the Dawnblade has taken in its millennial fight to continue to exist. As Kodian spoke, the weapon in his hand continued to shift and alter almost constantly, taking on the fleeting likenesses of every conceivable weapon, both alien and imperial. Its visage flicked from one to another with astounding speed, as if Anaris itself were revealing to them all the shapes it had taken during its lifetime. No sooner had this phenomenon manifested itself though than it began to die away, the changes growing slower and slower until the Dawnblade settled on one single manifestation. The hilt and blade swam and decreased in size, swiftly taking on the lesser dimensions of what appeared to be a knife or dagger. The weapon was unassuming in its appearance and yet bore a strikingly alien design, its flawless blade taking on a dazzling silver hue, but one that seemed almost to be tinged with emerald light. Kodian brandished this new form before the deceiver with some relish, the skin of his face bathed in the repellent radiance of this fresh facade. Slowly but surely, the Star God's features slackened. Kodian whispered, at last. Now you see. All you had to do was remember. Remember this and recognize your fate. Now you see the truth, and a race murdered by you and your kind may finally have peace. Farewell. The chaplain merely nodded in the direction of the Star God, as if the gesture alone was enough to cause him harm. Ma-Fei-Ran's golden form shuddered as it tensed and he made to rise, yet just as Kodian claimed he found he could not. A heartbeat later saw the surface of his golden skin begin to undulate, its surface rippling as if something was alive and slithering beneath. No, the deceiver whispered, his voice echoing and tinged with mounting disbelief. No, not that. This scenario is utterly impossible. And yet it is. Kodian replied, allowing a sneer to twist his upper lip. With that he spun on his heel and began to walk away. Behind him Ma-Fei-Ran began to split apart. The tear appeared at the center of his chest, the living metal skin parting as if split by some invisible blade. The nameless stuff of the Star God's incorporeal form blazed as it spilled from the wound, yet already it had begun to turn black and hazed with marbled corruption, as the newly birthed god of the dead unraveled within. Slowly, inexorably, Ennead began to tear the C'tan apart from the inside. 100 vengeful voices cried out in release, then 1,000, and soon the air shook with the voices of the hateful dead, for Ennead was at once every Eldar that had ever died, and the hatred that the Eldar shared for the C'tan was at once both ancient and racial. As Kodian passed them by, the Primarchs began to regain a measure of their ability to move. The surviving lords of mankind regarded his passage in silence, yet each gaze that met Kodian's own was one of profound respect. Kodian hesitated only slightly as he passed Guilliman. He inclined his head and bowed deeply. My Primarch, that I have lived to see you restored is to experience what is my heart's desire. I am both honored and humbled to stand in your shadow. The honor is mine, Dalokodian. Guilliman replied, tilting his head in the direction of the chaplain. I am proud to call you an ultramarine. I am proud to call you a son. Were you able to remain here, you would have a place at my side. However long the ultramarines endure, my son, so shall the name of Dalokodian. With that Guilliman slammed his knuckles into his breastplate and then thrust his arm out in salute. Around him the other Primarchs mirrored this gesture. At that moment Kodian wished with all his heart that he could allow himself to hesitate, to take stock of all that had occurred and all that was yet to do so, but he knew that he could not. He knew that this was still far from over and that he had duties yet to perform. A part of him wished that he could stay now, to witness the fruits of their endeavors, but even as he thought this he knew such desires were folly. His fate lay elsewhere, far from this world. Both Umbras and Grungy fell into step behind the chaplain, but if Kodian was even aware of this he did not show it. As Kodian passed into the shadows at the far end of the chamber, he did not witness the final moments of the being named Mephiran. He did not see the golden skin of his necrodermis finally give way, as the ever-growing power of Ennead tore it apart from within. However vast and incomprehensible the substance that gave the star god his existence, all that was Ennead was the absolute antithesis of that substance. Because of this Mephiran stood no chance at all of surviving the assault. The god Ennead existed because of the countless pooled souls of the Eldar dead, and so it was that those innumerable souls poured into the deceiver and tore him apart, atom by atom. Kodian saw none of this, nor did he see both Magnus and Ka, the latter finally soaking his way into reality from the surrounding shadows, as they set to work. Powers both strange and fantastic snatched the Primarchs up from where they stood and pulled them from the doomed chamber and away to another place, a safe place. This timing was far from coincidental. Beyond the throne and the struggling, dying god, the far wall began to shudder and quake. It was a golden partition, magnificent and beautiful, as ancient as any part of the palace. Slowly and unalterably the wall ground open, the gears of its mechanism turning. For the first time in millennia, the last of the living had exited the chamber by the time the first rays of unnatural light began to spill through the breach, and so it was only the shadows that played witness to the all-too-human expression of terror etched across the Citan's golden face as he finally realized his doom, and the cycle of prophecy found its completion. Ennead was a vengeful god indeed, but Ennead was not greedy, and there were others that were all too eager to share in the star god's demise. Inscient, fathomless things, entities that had spent their eternal existences within the Empyrean, awaiting this very moment. Mephiran was the last of the Citan to expire, but his death would be the longest. Brother. Kodian slowed as he heard the familiar voice. He spun on his heel to look into the eyes of Umbras. Even as he did so, he saw the beginnings of realization forming there. What now, chaplain? Is that it? Have we won? Yes, and no. Kodian answered, placing a hand upon the apothecary's shoulder. For you, this war is over. Rejoice, Umbras. Victory is ours. Then praise be to Guilliman and the Emperor, but I fear that you are preparing to depart, so I ask. Again. What now? Look of sadness passed over Kodian's face then. He gripped his brother's shoulder tightly. Grungy came to stand before him and rapped a fist against the Start's armored leg. Come now, Bonesaw. Do not get all maudlin. Brothers part ways every day of this existence. You of all people should have come to know this. To hold knowledge of a fact hardly makes it easier to accept. Umbras replied. Grungy offered up a shrug. Our paths will cross again, I can assure you of that. Until that time, I must bid you farewell. This war may be effectively over, but the fallout is going to prove to be a bitch, you mark my words. Thor alone knows who or what the hell we still have running around this little world. I figure that, seeing as I don't have my own people to safeguard, I may as well stay behind here and ally myself with the Longshanks. I can't be arsed with farewells. Until we meet again, Stockleg. With that Thurgus Grungy nodded at each of the warriors in turn and then set out at a brisk pace towards the nearest shifting mass of activity. Both Codian and Umbras watched his departure in silence until the demiurge was little more than a smudge on the horizon. Only then did Umbras break the silence. "What of me, Codian? I will not allow you take these final steps alone. I am afraid that you have little choice, brother. Where I am destined to go, you cannot follow. I cannot accept that. You must." Codian replied. "You are the future of our chapter now, my friend. You are a living link to a golden age, an age of purity and excellence. Our venerated father needs you now more than any other. He has a chapter to rebuild, and you shall be his template." Hearing this served to inject a measure of acceptance into the apothecary's expression. He gave a muted smile and stepped back, casting his gaze out across the ruin and desolation that stretched from horizon to horizon. "Our galaxy lies in ruins, Codian. Never before has our race seen such a daunting task. Look what the C'tan have done to this existence. Through the Tau they have laid waste to all we knew. And you are a living link to a glorious past, Umbras. Our father and Primarch may once again walk amongst us, but do not forget that you also hail from a time when mankind dominated the stars. You know of our past glories, and yes, our past failings. You are needed here, brother. Only with your help can these survivors hope to begin to rebuild." "You speak as if all wars are over and done," Umbras answered. "That is far from the truth." Codian tilted his head in deference to the apothecary's wisdom. "Of course you are right. There is still so much to do here. It pains me greatly to think that my part in this episode of the Imperium's existence is done. This could be the dawn of the greatest, most magnificent age since the Great Crusade, and yet I am able only to dream of what could be. You could return when you are done," Umbras whispered, his voice laden with optimism yet colored with doubt. Codian's expression gave him his answer long before the chaplain spoke. "That is unlikely, brother. Look at me now. Look at what I have been forced to become. Dalo Codian is dead, Umbras. He died long ago. As much as it pains me to admit, I am no longer a chaplain of the Ultramarines." "Do not say that," Umbras demanded, both hurt and angered by Codian's admission. Nonetheless, Codian stood by his claim. "It is true, and though I am saddened to admit as much, I take comfort in the fact that mine is a destiny shaped by the Emperor himself. Who or whatever I am now, I am because he willed it so. Even our venerable Primarch has recognized this much. I ask you to remember me, brother. Remember the warrior I was. The galaxy will remember you, Codian. I vow that much," Umbras replied, his voice heavy with emotion. Codian looked into the apothecary's eyes and, perhaps for the first time in the centuries he had known Umbras, he imagined that he could see the beginnings of grief. Codian took his brother and embraced him, for he knew that it would be unlikely that they would meet again. After a few moments Codian released Umbras and bowed his head, ready at last to leave this place. This time, Umbras mirrored the gesture and then stepped back, one hand rising to touch the icon of the Ultramarines chapter he wore upon his shoulder guard. "For as long as I live, I wear this symbol for the both of us. That is my promise to you. Fight well, brother. Die well. Courage and honor. Courage and honor." Codian echoed, and then said no more. Thunderclap of displaced air and an explosion of dark light, and he was gone. Epilogue. The feeling would never leave him, not as long as he lived, he knew that much. It was akin to grief. But it was so much more than that. He had lost a chapter, a family. He had lost all that he had known in order to serve the Emperor's will. Codian closed his eyes and let the hot, sandy winds scour the exposed skin of his face. It had been years since the end of the C'tan. That war was but a distant memory to him now, its ferocity and dreadfulness diminished by the passage of time. Time had indeed been a great healer. It had soothed the grief and the loss within him, but the one thing it had failed to diminish was the fervor he carried in his soul to see this task resolved. There were none save for the Emperor himself who could even have guessed at what he had been forced to endure in order to see the millennial plans of so many realized. So many had toiled for so long in order to see but a fraction of those strategies put in place, far-reaching strategies that would ultimately lead to the destruction of the star gods. Kodian found his hand wandering to the smooth curve of his shoulder guard, just as Umbra's hand had done all those years ago. The emblem he had once worn proudly there was long gone, removed through necessity, for he was Dalo Kodian no longer. All that he had once been was gone, lost forever in order to birth the strange and enigmatic warrior that was Cypher. Cypher. He said the name in his mind just as he had done so many times before, and still he found himself unable to fully comprehend all that he had become. Of course, in his own mind he would always be Dalo Kodian, that part of him would never be erased. He was possessed of a knowledge most sentient beings alive in the universe today could only dream of, and still there were elements of even his own existence that were mystery to him. He had accepted this fact long ago. There were answers that were simply unfathomable, no matter who you were. There were answers that even he was not meant to understand. His birth, or rather transformation into the being known as Cypher, had been so gradual as to astonish even him. Had anyone ever told him that one day he would willingly give up all that made him a son of Ultramar, he would have surely dealt him or her a death blow. Fate had seized hold of him and demanded this change, and it had been a change of ultimate necessity, despite the fact that he still despised all he had become. Once, he would have sought to destroy that which he now was, that which others of the Imperium had sought to destroy since. Most fervent of those who hunted him were the Angels of the Lion, the warriors of the First Legion. They hunted him because they were blind to the truth of Cypher, and it was a necessary blindness. They hunted him because they believed him to be one of the fallen, those of the Dark Angels that had betrayed their chapter, their primarch, and their emperor millennia ago. Of course, he cared little for such impersonal histories. Time and again they tried to apprehend him, to bring him to task. Time and again, they failed. They would always fail, for his was the divine mission. His was an undertaking both blessed and consecrated by the Emperor himself. Still, there were many such as the Dark Angels that had always fought long and hard to obliterate the being they knew only as Cypher, and despite his ability to traverse the tides of time, he had always found the Dark Angels waiting, determined to end him. One day they would perhaps even succeed, but not today. Not today. Here in the shadow of the ancient monolithic structure he had found a measure of relief from the unforgiving sun. Shadows moved around him, dark and hulking, speaking as they always did in hushed, calculated tones. He paid them no heed, too lost in his own thoughts to care. One hand rested against the hilt of the Dawnblade, his ever-faithful companion, and he allowed himself a smile at the reassuring sensation of weight at his hip. For so long had the blade been his only constant attendant, and in truth it was Anaris who alone shared the weight of secrets within his mind. Here, alone amongst company, he cast his gaze beyond the shifting armored warriors surrounding him to where the red dunes and the towering black structures stretched out into the distance in every direction. This was a dead world, a desolate world. This was a world he had visited more than once. He thought back to the strange visions all those years ago, realizing only now that they had not been visions at all, but rather relocations. These warriors, clad in their dark armor, they too had met him before, when the mystifying powers he had inherited had dragged him back here again and again. One of the warriors noticed his scrutiny of them and moved to converse with him. The glassy red sand crunched beneath the ancient giant's heels as he slung his bolter about him and slid back his cowl to reveal his weathered, scarred face. "How long, Cypher? Do you sense him?" "No," he replied with a gentle shake of the head and an outstretched palm. "Be patient, Steelin. I feel the souls of the dead stirring even now. Nares grows restless. We will have our glory soon." The blond giant scowled but seemed to grudgingly accept this. He turned away, ever watchful of his surroundings. Alone with his thoughts once more, Kodian found his hand wandering to the faded Leather tube secreted beneath the folds of the tattered robe he now wore over his plate. He flicked the tube open and slid the frayed parchment there free. Ensuring that there were no eyes upon him, he spread the paper out and read the words there. He had studied the words written here for many years, and he had contemplated them so many times he could never hope to count. He understood them, or at least he empathized with their meaning. Still, he found himself drawn to them, even after all this time. Time most distant, future's zenith. In tears, the star sea mourns. Isha's children lament. LL is lost to arrogance, grand designs soured by success, dreams are dust. Shattered and done, the progeny set sail for the forever beyond, flight borne on the tides of shame. To dwindle and expire, forever denied. The new star burns too intense to douse, unchecked, untamed. God's despair. Tide surges, the end time is come. The future, of course. A future time incomprehensible to the faithful of the Emperor. The galaxy is in turmoil. The Eldar, mortified and appalled by their role as the supposed creators of Tau, begin to dwindle away. The Tau reach the zenith of their evolution as a race and swiftly become the dominant force amongst the stars. Now that he knew all he knew, Kodian could see how obvious this interpretation was. Future's path runs red as Kain blood, hate winter rages, the portents scream their siren song. The song of old Hanush is silent, Isha's eye closed in slumber. Suryan's shrine light flickers and dies. The cosmic serpent reveals the truth and sheds his final skin. The rebirth is denied. The doom of Eldanesh comes to pass, the red moon rises. The Ranadandra is come, let young and old cower before the chaos of the end. The Eldar race as a whole suffers greatly in the face of this uprising. Listed, or rather represented, are several of the most powerful craft worlds of the Eldar. The final war is come. The new star will rise unprecedented, all the dread despoilers of the old kingdom quail beneath its fire. Dead King shivers on his maggot throne as the tide assails his walls, his kingdom lost. Locust flees, no longer to plague creation fields, feast denied. Slave puppets, once free, now lie in chains, conquered anew, rebellion's essence bound in blood. Long dead are exhumed, tombs raised. There shall be no flight, no peace in death. Their gods shall tremble. Imperial, Xenos and heretic alike recoil in the face of the Tau ascendant, no matter how powerful. Mentioned here are the Emperor, and thus the Imperium at large. The Tyranids are driven beyond the stars. The Orc is enslaved and brought beneath the yoke of the Unity. The Tau make war even with the Necrontyr. Damned shores become bastion as dark souls return. Exodus flight before the rising swell. Denizens of Underkingdom cower behind its gates as the tide surges. Shame can be damned in the bowels of the webway, vermin scuttling in filth and terror, afraid of the rage scream storm above. Let them gather souls in shame and desperate haste, past sins quail as the all thirst is quenched. The brightest hope may lie amongst the darkest of shadow, the learned mongrel soul exhumed to see a destiny fulfilled. Many mighty kings shall offer their swords to the tide. None shall escape. None shall escape. The legions of the Chaos Gods retreat into the eye. The fallen brethren of the Eldar are forced to impose self-exile. After careful study of the following section, Kodian had decided that it referred to the return of Jagatai Khan. Many would offer themselves to the Unity. None would truly be spared. Its wrath. Skeins divided, hope defiant. Light and darkness heed, else collide, and be damned. Fractured as is death, no other path leads to hope. Existence tree be raised to its roots, bitter leaves cleansed. Then can hope's light flicker. LL forgotten. To the core of creation. Then can hope's flame catch the breeze. Let the lost princes of the young gather, shoulder to shoulder they alone may weather the hate. Winter's wrath. Bright hope's flame still burns deep in the shadows of the dead land, too powerful to extinguish. Forever. Soul beacon, the horn of Kurnus will sound the call to war. They shall gather, let but some of their names be known. The future is never truly written in stone. All must cast aside the most ancient of enmities if the Tau are to be beaten. The Primarchs are the key. Ennead stirs, ready to fulfill a destiny divined untold eons before. Many mighty warriors will heed the call to war. Codian smiled as he read the followed excerpt, as the memories of those who had fought alongside him were stirred once again by the words. The Revenant. Eldrad Ulthran, the ancient soul of Ulthwi. The first and ever lords of war. The Phoenix Lords. The Lost Princes. The Primarchs. The memory of those magnificent beings never failed to stir his soul and fuel his pride. The Wrathful Masters. The Cabal, those primeval beings that had shaped the destiny of the galaxy since the end of the First War with the C'tan. The Reapers of Light. The C'tan. The Star Vampires. The Stolen Giant. Guilliman, the greatest of the Primarchs, taken from his internment on Makraj. The Prophet. He was the Prophet, of course. The Last Avenger. Grungy. A giant amongst warriors, in every way save for stature. Codian knew that he would not forget Thurgus Grungy as long as he lived. The Entombed Ancient. Calgar, arguably the greatest war master the Imperium had ever known. The Oracle. Chivok. The Blazing Rebel. Farza'ite, the fire warrior and noble soul of the Tau resistance. All these names and more shall stand ready as the Ranadandra dawns in the light of the final day casts her glow upon armor and weapon. The End War. The final battle. Maelstrom, life, and death gather for war, old and young collide beneath the red moon. Origin. Revealed, too sour a taste to accept. It matters not, what is, is. God's splintered reform indeed to counter the twilight. The children rise, menagerie gather in bitter winds of division's death. Choice is murdered for all time, no longer sustainable and revealed. Irrelevance. Diversity is power, the only power left unconsumed. Youth's vigor and appetite insatiable above all else, desperation will rule the firmament. There can be no more old thought. Every shadow will shift. Writhe with hidden stirring. Life's last breath must be deep. Many great and dark secrets are revealed. The implications matter not. All that matters is victory. Ka returns to lend his wisdom and might to the cause. All the free races of the galaxy unite. No free soul dares to deny the call to war. Let them stand on the final shore as one, faces turned to the tide. I have seen future's zenith. I have seen crux and apex. Past, present, and future united. Enmity is not survival. History rewritten at its very core, primeval puzzle complete. One must tell the tale. Paths cannot be altered, only destinations revealed. Unity. When the ashway clears, no more division, only unity. The great unity will prevail. All must stand together as one. All must fight the Tau. One must tell the tale. This referred to him. His would be the saga, the legend that would steer all the forces that could oppose the Tau. Together. The great unity will prevail. Life. Man and Xenos alike. Life would prevail. Codian took in a deep, cleansing breath and lowered the parchment. Chivok had given him this gift. And it was one of his most treasured possessions. Chivok. He had not even bid the Inquisitor farewell. In those final hours before he had left the aftermath of the war behind for good, and that troubled him. There were many brave and honorable souls that he wished that he could have spoken to one final time, or even shared a parting hand of comradeship with, but then again there was little that was final to him now, not with the abilities he possessed. This thought gave Codian a measure of comfort. None who had been lost to him were truly gone, not to him. Of course, his was a path that was set in stone, and to deviate from it even a fraction could have catastrophic consequences. Yes, it was true that he was able to negotiate the temporal eddies of the warp, but to do so independent of the complex and far-reaching plans that now ruled his existence would be to invite disaster. True, in his lifetime the war had already been won, but this was the past, at least to him. Even the consideration of such complex temporal matters as this threatened to overwhelm his psyche, but even though he knew that he dared not deviate this prearranged path, it remained as some measure of comfort to him the fact that he knew he possessed the ability to effectively revisit the past, no matter the outcome. No, his was an existence as far removed from selfishness as any could be. His desires were obsolete, utterly defunct in the greater scheme of things. His was an existence already given over to a cause far greater than any personal motivation, for he was nothing save for an instrument of fate. Through him, the Emperor's schemes would be realized. He would gain justification for his existence, and he relished that fact. Kodian held up the tattered parchment, allowing the wind to catch its frayed edges. He held it aloft, indifferent to the hissing breeze that caught its edges and threatened to tear it from his grasp. At his side Astlan started, concerned by the predicament of the parchment within Kodian's grasp. "My lord." Kodian let the paper slip away from between his armored fingers, utterly unconcerned by its previous importance. He watched as the threadbare parchment twisted away on the breeze, sure that he no longer required the crumbling sheet. "Do not concern yourself, Stelan. It is simply time." "Time?" said the ancient warrior, clearly troubled by the departure of the threadbare sheet. Indeed, he and the others had watched as Kodian had scrutinized the mysterious document for years, so much so that, to them, it had become a part of him. Because of this, to watch it simply disappear into the swirling, sand-choked distance caused them all no small amount of alarm. "Yes," Kodian replied, as a serene look settled upon his face. "It is time to let go." An age had passed since the Great War, and though that dark and terrible time remained at the forefront of his mind, he had endured much since, more than any save for those warriors around him could possibly imagine. That both the Inquisition and the Dark Angels hunted him zealously would be almost amusing to him were it not for the fact that both he and his pursuers fought for the same cause, he thought to himself. Those who sought him, who wished for nothing less than his utter destruction, could never truly know the warrior they chased. It was a linear hunt, at least in the eyes of the Angels and the Inquisition. They could not realize that the random sightings and the fleeting confrontations were actually predestined undertakings, or that skirmishes that occurred hundreds of years apart were, at least for Kodian, subsequent and immediate, for his was a mission that spanned the ages. All that he had to do, had to be done in perfect sequence according to the Emperor's great plan. He had found himself forced to undertake tasks that would have sickened him in his former guise as chaplain of the Ultramarines. He had found it on occasion necessary even to take the lives of servants of the Imperium, Asteroutes even. Of course, such grim tasks had darkened his soul, and he had found himself forced to mourn for those he had murdered many times, yet despite all this he had always known with utter surety that he was doing what needed to be done. The absolute clarity of purpose gifted to him by the Akasha was enough to dispel the greatest regret, for he alone knew of all that would befall the galaxy were he even to hesitate in his duties. No, Dalo Kodian had long since made peace with all that he had become and all that he had done. Since becoming Cypher, he had trawled the ages since, flitting from one era to the next, the fallen in tow. Like him, these were warriors cursed with the task of writing the greatest strategy that history had ever known, one so complex and elaborate that even the greatest mortal minds of the galaxy could never hope to fully comprehend its logic. Again he thought back to those final moments, to the victory within the Emperor's chamber. To leave when he did had left a bitter taste in his mouth, one that he knew he would never rid himself of. Self-interest was the last thing on his mind, but there had been so much left unresolved. Although he knew that those who remained behind were more than fully capable of fashioning a new and powerful Imperium, he knew that he would always regret the fact that he was never fated to remain amongst them. The defeat of the Citan had been both his greatest desire and his most fervent obligation, yet the death of the Deceiver had been but the catalyst that signaled change on a galactic scale. Change? How had life changed for those he had left behind? Long before the Imperium had even been aware of the existence of the Citan, long before even the emergence of the Tau, it had always known war. It had always known threat, from both without and within. Truly there were none alive who had known anything like peace for more than a fleeting moment. Kodian had left behind a victory, that much was true, but the destiny of the Imperium was far from secured. Both the C'tan and their unliving slaves, the Necrontyr, were gone, as were the Eldar, at least as far as he was aware, but what of the other disparate factions that fought to dominate the stars? What of the Tau, the former dominant force amongst the stars? What did their fate hold for them? What of the Orcs, or indeed the forces of chaos, both once sworn enemies of man and of the rule of the Emperor? That same Emperor was gone now. Some may say evolved, finally free of the cage of ruined flesh that had held him immobile for so long. How could his race possibly continue to survive without the Emperor? These questions and more had dominated his thoughts for generations, and though he was possessed of an innate ability to simply know, or rather sense the answer to any question, he could not see any clear way forward, any true conclusion. Perhaps it was that the human race, that indeed every race abroad in the galaxy was simply made for conflict. Perhaps it had always been that peace was stagnation, that life could never truly exist in concord with itself. Perhaps the old ones had fashioned life to be thus. Kodian knew that such answers were never truly destined to be his, but that fact did nothing to quash his curiosity. It was only natural for one to wonder about the fruits of one's labors. He knew why he strived to achieve all that he had achieved, and yet he could never truly know what was to follow the outcome of his endeavors. Astlan had once asked him a question, and Kodian had found it to be the only question he could not answer. The fallen Dark Angel had asked him what was to become of them after this coming conflict. Truly, Kodian did not know. What lay beyond today had always been hidden from him, obscured by the blinding light of what destiny had in store for him today. In truth, the future mattered little to him. That he was destined to secure the annihilation of the deceiver was enough. Now, as ever, he was a son of the Emperor, and the Emperor bade him follow a specific path. Whether or not he or any of the others would survive this encounter mattered little to him, but if there was a chance, even the slightest chance, that he would live beyond today, he vowed to himself that he would not waste that gift. He had spent an age skipping between the ages, ensuring that he quest follow as non-linear a path as it was possible to take, for this was the only sure way he knew of guaranteeing that he continue to confound the C'tan. New York other way would doubtless have alerted the deceiver to the truth of his actions, and he could not have allowed that. Today would see the completion of that long-standing quest, and it was a day even he had almost begun to doubt would ever arrive. The others stirred in their positions beyond him then, and though no coherent words of warning were spoken, he understood what was happening. He felt it, they all did, that subtle shift in the ambience surrounding them. The undulating winds continued to moan through the towering structures, but even that seemed to quieten, almost as if the planet itself was apprehensive of the imminent arrival. Astlan fired off a sharp series of clipped orders that sent warriors jogging away in twos and threes in every direction. Kodian knew that he could let the veteran Marine direct the others with confidence. All he had to do was to ensure that he remained ready to meet the coming challenge. That it would indeed be a challenge was something he did not doubt. The change in the air was almost instantaneous. He could taste the electrical tang on his tongue. The incessant grainy wind carried the taint of the enemy, that sharp metallic essence he had come to expect. They were here. Warriors jogged into their predetermined positions all around him as they prepared to move deeper into the bowels of the rock. The explorator team approach. It is time to move, Steelen informed him. The warrior's warning had been totally unnecessary, yet Kodian nodded despite this. He turned to look upon the rectangular gateway of absolute void that penetrated the ruins beyond them. He had always known of the predestined arrival of the Mechanikus upon this long-dead world, this dry and lifeless orb he had come to know as Thelmax. This was not the first time the Mechanikus had come here, but this was the time that they would witness what needed to be witnessed, and thus the legend and indeed the prophecy would endure. The time was upon him now. Although he could neither see nor hear them, he knew the enemy were stirring far beneath his feet. He could feel the quickening of destiny in his bones and knew that today, the fate of a monster would at last be sealed. He hesitated then, determined to check that everything was in place one last time. He could feel the weight of the lion's sword at his back, as reassuring as it ever was. Likewise, the pistols hung ever by his sides, ready for use, as faithful as any companions could be. Lastly, he drew the dawn blade from its scabbard and lifted the weapon up so that it was level with his face. Ever since he had begun this quest, the weapon had assumed one permanent form, that of the small alien knife. He turned the knife over in his hand, watching as the emerald light played across its silvered blade, and he could not help but smile. So flawless, this deceit. So total the transformation that even a god would be unable to tell the difference. It is almost time, he whispered to the blade. You have served me well, just as we have both served our father as best we could. I will mourn your loss, should I survive. Anaris did not answer him, for to even expect this would have been foolish, yet he could sense the reciprocation as both a palpable and emotive shift in the ambience about him. Anaris understood. It was time. Follow me, Codian uttered to the fallen, diving headlong into the void. Upon the dead world of Thelmax, our Adeptus Mechanicus explorator team researched the ruins beneath the fractured crust of this barren rock. Several previous expeditions to this planet had already been lost, but an entire company of veteran soldiers and a squad of space marines guarded this expedition. Upon our arrival at the site of the previous expedition, we were astounded to find a battle underway between a group of dark-armored warriors and strange silver-skinned constructs of gleaming metal. They fought before a rippling gateway of jade-veined darkness as a being with skin of shimmering gold killed the warriors with ease, each languorous blow from its hand cutting a warrior down. But I saw that, alone amongst the dark warriors, a single figure darted through the combat, firing twin pistols and evading every blow. As the golden being turned to face him, he slashed its torso with a shining silver knife. No sooner had the blade struck than it was wrenched from his hand and swallowed whole within its golden flesh. The sounds of battle continued, but a dark veil dropped around the combatants, and when next I looked into the tomb, there was no sign that anything had occurred. The chamber was empty. Explorator Majorist Oreth. Suppressed. M41. Thelmax, Primus Site. End. Check the description for the links to the author.